Picture this, or standing in the howling darkness of a Norse winter, where the sun barely kisses the horizon for a few precious hours each day. The wind cuts through the landscape like 1,000 frozen blades, and the temperature has plummeted to levels that would make your smartphone shut down in seconds. There's no central heating, no thermostat to adjust, no corner store to grab emergency supplies. And here's the kicker. There are no fireplaces, not a single brick chimney in sight. Yet somehow, impossibly, the Vikings not only survived these brutal conditions, they thrived in them. They raised families, told stories, crafted legendary weapons, and built a civilization that would echo through the centuries. But how? The answer is going to blow your mind, and it starts with a secret that's been buried in the frozen earth for over 1,000 years. Before we journey deeper into this mystery, if you're enjoying this trip back in time, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you're gonna want to stick around for more stories like this one. And hey, drop a comment below telling me which historical mystery you'd like us to unravel next. Now, let's step through the doorway into a world where survival was an art form and warmth was literally a matter of life and death. The year is 890 AD. In a remote settlement along the windswept coast of what we now call Norway, a woman named Astrid wakes before dawn. The darkness is absolute, thick enough to feel like a physical presence pressing against her skin. She doesn't reach for a light switch because, well, it's gonna be another 1,100 years before anyone invents electricity. Instead, she lies still for a moment, listening to the symphony of her household, the breathing of her 3 children, curled together like puppies beneath layers of fur and wool, the gentle snoring of her husband, Bjorn, whose calloused hands, even in sleep, rest protectively near his family. The wind outside sounds like wolves howling, but Astrid isn't afraid. She's been through 42 winters in this unforgiving land, and she knows something that modern people have completely forgotten. She knows how to survive without the things we consider absolutely essential. Astrid rises slowly, careful not to disturb the carefully constructed cocoon of warmth around her family. The air in the longhouse is cold, sure, but it's not the bone-shattering, life-threatening cold that lurks just beyond the walls. There's a reason for that, and it has nothing to do with fireplaces. In fact, the concept of a fireplace as we know it, a contained fire with a chimney that vents smoke up and out of the house, is completely foreign to Astrid's world. The Vikings had something else entirely, something that archaeologists and historians would spend centuries trying to fully understand. The longhouse where Astrid and her family live is a marvel of engineering that would make modern architects sit up and take notice. It's not just a building, it's a carefully designed ecosystem, a living organism that breathes with its inhabitants. The structure stretches roughly 90 feet in length and about 20 feet in width, with walls that curve slightly inward as they rise. These walls aren't made of brick or stone, though. They're constructed from vertical wooden planks, hewn from the massive pines and oaks that once covered Scandinavia like a blanket. But here's where it gets interesting. Between the inner and outer wooden walls, there's a gap. And that gap is stuffed with something that would seem pretty mundane to us, but was absolutely crucial to Viking survival. Earth, moss, turf, layers and layers of organic material, compressed and packed tight as a drum. This wasn't just insulation in the modern sense. This was a living, breathing barrier that created a microclimate within the longhouse. The organic material trapped air in thousands of tiny pockets, and air, as any scientist will tell you, is one of the best insulators on the planet. But the Vikings didn't know the science. They just knew it worked, and they'd been perfecting this technique for generations, passing down knowledge from parent to child in an unbroken chain that stretched back into the mists of prehistory. Astrid moves through the darkness with the confidence of someone who could navigate her home blindfolded. Her bare feet, tough as leather from years of walking on rough surfaces, barely register the packed earth floor beneath them. The floor itself is another crucial element of Viking winter survival. It's not just dirt. Over the years, layers upon layers of rushes, straw, and dried herbs have been laid down, trampled, and compressed into a surface that's surprisingly warm and springy. The decomposition of organic material actually generates a small amount of heat, though the Vikings probably didn't understand the biochemistry involved. They just knew that a well-maintained floor stayed warmer than bare earth. Now you might be thinking, okay, so they had good insulation and a fancy floor, but what about actual heat? Where did that come from, if not from a fireplace? Well, hold on to your hats, because this is where things get really wild. In the center of the longhouse, running almost its entire length, there's a long rectangular pit. It's shallow, maybe a foot deep at most, and lined with flat stones that have been carefully selected and placed. This is the Langeld, the long fire, and it's the beating heart of Viking winter survival. But here's the thing that trips people up. The Langeld isn't roaring with flames. It's not a bonfire or a campfire or anything like what we might imagine. Instead, it's carefully maintained at a level that's almost smoldering. Picture a bed of glowing coals, red and orange, and occasionally flickering with small flames when someone adds a piece of wood. The smoke, and there's definitely smoke, doesn't go up a chimney because, remember, chimneys as we know them haven't been invented yet. Instead, the smoke rises, hits the roof, and then does something absolutely fascinating. The roof of a Viking longhouse is constructed with the same genius as the walls. It's thatched, usually with reeds or straw, and it's layered so thick that it might be 3 feet deep in places. The smoke from the Langeld filters up through this thatch, and in the process, several things happen simultaneously. First, the smoke deposits creosote and other compounds onto the underside of the roof, which actually helps preserve the wood and thatch, making it last longer and resist rot. Second, the warm smoke heats the entire roof structure, which then radiates that heat back down into the living space. And third, the smoke eventually filters out through the thatch itself, which acts like a natural ventilation system. You're probably thinking, wouldn't everyone just die from smoke inhalation? It's a fair question, and the answer lies in the careful balance that Viking builders achieved. The Langeld is never allowed to produce too much smoke. The wood is carefully selected, dried wood that burns cleanly, producing minimal smoke for the amount of heat generated. And the people living in the longhouse spend most of their time at a level where the air is clearest. The smoke naturally rises and accumulates in the upper portions of the longhouse, while the breathable air stays lower. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, and yeah, Vikings probably did have respiratory issues as a result, but it worked well enough to keep entire communities alive through winters that would kill an unprepared modern person in hours. Astrid reaches the Langeld and kneels beside it. The coals from last night's fire are still glowing faintly, like dragon eyes in the darkness. She doesn't need to see them clearly. She can feel the heat radiating from the stone-lined pit, warming her hands and face. With practiced movements, she selects small pieces of dried wood from the stack kept nearby. Not just any wood, mind you. This is wood that's been seasoned for at least a year, stored in a dry place where it could lose as much moisture as possible. Wet wood creates more smoke and less heat, and in a Viking longhouse, that's a recipe for disaster. She places the wood carefully onto the coals, not smothering them, but giving them room to breathe. Within minutes, small flames begin to lick at the new fuel. The light grows, pushing back the darkness, and Astrid can now see the interior of her home. The walls are hung with tapestries, not for decoration primarily, though they're beautiful, woven with intricate patterns that tell stories of gods and heroes. No, these tapestries serve a practical purpose. They create another layer of insulation, another barrier between the inhabitants and the frozen world outside. The air trapped between the tapestry and the wall provides additional insulation, and the thick wool itself is naturally resistant to heat loss. As the fire grows, Astrid can see her family beginning to stir. Her oldest son, Eric, a boy of 13 summers, sits up and rubs his eyes. He's at that awkward age where he's not quite a man, but no longer really a child. In a few more years, he might go raiding with his father, or perhaps he'll become a trader, sailing to distant lands that Astrid can barely imagine. But for now, he's just a sleepy teenager who doesn't want to leave the warmth of his bed. "Get up, lazy bones," Astrid says with a smile that Eric probably can't see in the dim firelight. Winter waits for no one, and there's work to be done. This is a phrase that Viking children heard constantly during the long winter months. Work, always work, because survival in the Arctic winter wasn't passive. It wasn't just a matter of building a good house and then sitting around waiting for spring. It required constant, active effort. Every single day brought new challenges, new tasks that absolutely had to be completed if the family was going to make it through to the thaw. Eric groans but complies, sliding out from under the furs. The sudden change in temperature makes him gasp, and he quickly pulls on the layers of clothing that were laid out the night before. Multiple layers, that's key. The Vikings understood something that modern outdoor enthusiasts have rediscovered. It's not about one really thick garment, it's about multiple layers that trap air between them. Eric starts with a linen undershirt, thin and next to his skin. Over that goes a wool tunic, then another wool tunic, then wool pants, then wool leg wrappings that extend from ankle to knee. Over all of this, he'll eventually add an outer cloak made of thick wool that's been treated with lanolin to make it water resistant. Wool was absolutely essential to Viking survival, and it's worth taking a moment to appreciate just how important sheep were to these people. Sheep provided wool, sure, but they also provided meat, milk, cheese, and even their bones and horns could be fashioned into tools and other useful items. The wool was particularly special because, unlike plant fibers, wool retains its insulating properties even when wet. When wool gets damp, the individual fibers actually generate a small amount of heat through a process that wouldn't be scientifically understood for centuries. The Vikings just knew that wool kept you warm, even in the nastiest conditions. If you're still listening and finding yourself drifting off to sleep, that's absolutely perfect. That's exactly what this story is designed to do. But before you fully drift away, maybe give that like button a gentle tap. It helps other people find these restful journeys through history. And hey, if you're still with me, there's so much more to discover about how these incredible people mastered their environment. By now, the rest of the family is waking. Astrid's husband Bjorn sits up and immediately checks the Langeld. It's a reflexive action, something he does multiple times throughout the day and night. Keeping the fire going is literally a matter of life and death, and it's a responsibility shared by all members of the household. The fire is never allowed to go out completely during winter. If it did, restarting it would be challenging. The Vikings had fire-starting tools, of course. They used flint and steel, or sometimes a bow drill, but these methods took time and effort. Much better to simply maintain the fire at a low level constantly. Bjorn stretches, his muscles tight from sleep and cold. At 38, he's already an old man by Viking standards, though he's strong and healthy. His face is weathered, etched with lines from years of squinting into snow glare and sea spray. His hands are massive, scarred from countless tasks, from handling ship ropes to wielding weapons to crafting the intricate woodwork that decorates the longhouse. He stands and moves to one of the walls where there's a small opening, barely visible behind a tapestry. This is one of the adjustable air vents that help control the atmosphere inside the longhouse. The Vikings had figured out something that would take European architects many more centuries to fully understand: the importance of controlled ventilation. The longhouse isn't sealed tight. If it were, the inhabitants would suffocate from the smoke and from their own respiration. Instead, there are carefully placed openings, holes really, that can be opened or closed depending on the conditions. On a night when the wind is howling and the temperature has dropped dangerously low, these vents might be closed almost completely, just a tiny gap left to allow some fresh air in and some smoke out. On milder days, they might be opened wider to clear out accumulated smoke and bring in fresh air. Bjorn adjusts the vent, opening it slightly. He can tell from the sound of the wind and the quality of the cold air seeping in that the worst of the night storm has passed. It's still brutally cold outside, make no mistake, but survivable for short periods if you're properly dressed. And there are things that need to be done outside, tasks that can't be delayed. The younger children are waking now. Little Freya, just 6 years old, and her brother Olaf, who's 9. They emerge from their nest of furs like bear cubs from a den, blinking and shivering despite the growing warmth from the Langold. Astrid already has food prepared for them. This is another crucial aspect of Viking winter survival that often gets overlooked: food. The sheer amount of food needed to keep a human body warm and functional in Arctic conditions is staggering. The children's breakfast consists of porridge made from barley and oats, cooked slowly overnight at the edge of the Langold. The porridge is thick, almost solid, and it's been enriched with butter and a small amount of honey, both precious commodities in the winter months. With the porridge, there's dried fish, rehydrated and flaked, and a piece of hard cheese that's so dense it has to be shaved into thin slices. The children also drink milk, fresh from the cows that are housed in an attached building, sharing their body heat with the humans. That's right, the animals lived right next door. In the harshest parts of Scandinavia, the longhouse and the barn might actually be the same building, with a partition separating humans from livestock. This wasn't just about convenience, it was about heat. A single cow generates as much heat as several small fires, and when you have a dozen cows, some goats, and maybe some sheep all in one enclosed space, you've got yourself a significant heat source. The Vikings arranged their buildings so that this animal-generated warmth could benefit the human living spaces. Genius, really, when you think about it. As the family eats, Bjorn outlines the day's tasks. This is another survival strategy that modern people could learn from. Every day had a plan, and everyone knew their role. There was no confusion, no debate about who was supposed to do what. The structure and routine weren't about being controlling. They were about survival, when every day might bring a new crisis, when the margin between life and death was measured in degrees of temperature and hours of preparation. You couldn't afford chaos. Today, Bjorn and Eric will be checking on the livestock, making sure the animals have enough food and water. They'll also need to inspect the barn structure for any damage from the storm. A hole in the barn roof might seem like a minor problem, but if snow gets in and melts on the animals, getting them wet, those animals could die from the cold. Then the family loses not just the immediate warmth the animals provide, but also their future milk, meat, and leather. It's a domino effect that the Vikings understood all too well. Astrid and the younger children will be working on textiles. This was never-ending work during the winter months. Clothes wear out, especially when you're wearing multiple layers every single day. Socks develop holes, tunics fray at the seams, cloaks need patching, and beyond simple repairs, there was always new clothing to be made. Children grow, after all, and a tunic that fit Eric at the start of winter might be too small by spring. So Astrid sits at her loom, the vertical warp threads already in place, and begins the rhythmic process of weaving. Little Freya sits nearby with a spindle, learning to spin wool into thread. Her efforts are clumsy, the thread uneven and lumpy, but Astrid doesn't criticize. The girl is learning, and by the time she's a woman grown, her hands will move as confidently as her mother's. As the morning progresses, the longhouse warms up, not to modern room temperature, mind you. If you walked into a Viking longhouse in the middle of winter, you'd probably think it was pretty chilly, maybe in the mid-50s Fahrenheit. But compared to the sub-zero temperatures outside, it feels positively toasty. The family has shed some of their outer layers, working comfortably in their inner tunics and pants. The Langeld is going strong now, the flames more visible, dancing and flickering in a way that's almost hypnotic. Fire had an almost magical quality for the Vikings. It provided warmth, obviously, but also light in the long darkness, a way to cook food, a means of working metal for tools and weapons, and a gathering place for the family. The stories tell us that the gods themselves lived in places of fire and ice, and in a way, so did the Vikings. They existed in that narrow band between the killing cold and the life-giving warmth, and they'd learned to master both. Around midday, though the sun barely climbs above the horizon at this latitude and time of year, Bjorn and Eric prepare to venture outside. They layer up, adding more wool, wrapping their faces with scarves woven from the softest wool to protect against frostbite. They pull on mittens, not gloves. The Vikings had learned that keeping your fingers together conserved more warmth than separating them. They put on boots made of leather, stuffed with dried grass for insulation, and wrapped tightly with more leather strips to keep out snow and moisture. Before they open the door, there's a moment of mental preparation. They both know what's waiting out there. The cold isn't just uncomfortable, it's actively hostile, trying to steal the life right out of your body. Exposed skin can develop frostbite in minutes. Breathe too deeply, and the cold air can damage your lungs. Fall down in the snow and get your clothes wet, and you might not make it back to the house alive. This isn't an exaggeration or dramatic storytelling. This is the reality that Vikings faced every single day during winter. Bjorn pulls open the door, and the cold rushes in like a living thing. Everyone in the longhouse instinctively pulls away from it, hunching their shoulders and turning their faces. The temperature inside the house immediately drops several degrees just from that brief opening. Bjorn and Eric slip outside quickly, and Bjorn pulls the door shut behind them with a solid thunk. Outside, the world is transformed. Snow has accumulated several feet deep in places, sculpted by the wind into fantastic shapes that look almost like frozen waves. The sky is a pale, washed-out blue, and the sun hangs low on the horizon, providing light but precious little warmth. The wind is still blowing, not as hard as last night, but enough to send snow devils swirling across the landscape. The temperature is probably around -10 Fahrenheit, but the wind chill makes it feel much, much colder. Father and son trudge through the snow toward the barn, which is attached to the longhouse by a covered walkway. This walkway is another crucial piece of Viking architecture. It means that even in the worst weather, the family can access their animals without being fully exposed to the elements. The walkway is enclosed on the sides and roofed, though wind and snow still find ways to creep in through cracks and gaps. The barn, when they enter it, is warmer than outside, but still cold by modern standards. The animals, however, seem comfortable enough. Cows are remarkably hardy creatures, and these particular cows are descendants of animals that have been living in Scandinavian conditions for thousands of years. They've adapted, developing thicker winter coats and more efficient metabolisms. Still, they require constant care. Bjorn and Eric check each animal, looking for signs of illness or injury. They fill the feeding troughs with dried hay, stored in a loft above the animal pens. They break up the ice in the water troughs, using an axe kept for just this purpose, and refill them with fresh water carried from inside the longhouse. This water, by the way, came from snow that was melted in large pots placed near the Langeld. You couldn't just go to a well in winter because the well was frozen solid. You couldn't drink snow directly because eating snow lowers your core body temperature. So every drop of water used in the longhouse during winter had to be created through the laborious process of melting snow. It took a lot of snow to make a little water, and it took a lot of time and fire to melt that snow. Water wasn't wasted. Every drop was precious. While Bjorn and Eric work in the barn, back in the longhouse, something interesting is happening. Neighbors have started arriving. In the dead of winter, Vikings didn't isolate themselves completely. They visited each other, shared news and gossip, helped with large tasks, and most importantly, told stories. This communal aspect of Viking life was another survival strategy, though they probably didn't think of it in those terms. Humans are social creatures, and the psychological toll of being trapped indoors for months on end can be just as dangerous as the physical challenges. Depression, cabin fever, conflicts between family members. These were real threats to survival, and the Vikings combated them through community. The visitors who arrive at Astrid's longhouse are bundled beyond recognition, looking almost like walking piles of fur and wool. As they enter and shed their outer layers, they reveal themselves to be Gunnar and his wife Inga, along with their 2 teenage daughters. They live in a longhouse just a few hundred yards away, though in a blizzard, that distance might as well be miles. Today, though, with the storm past and the wind reduced, it's a manageable journey. The guests are immediately offered places near the Langeld and given warm drinks. The Vikings made a kind of hot beverage from barley, sometimes fermented into a weak beer, sometimes just roasted, and then steeped in hot water like tea. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot, and after a walk through sub-zero temperatures, hot was beautiful. As the adults settle in, the conversation flows naturally. They discuss the storm, comparing experiences. Gunnar's family lost some shingles from their roof. Not a catastrophe, but something that'll need to be fixed before the next storm. They talk about the animals, the food stores, the gossip from the settlement. Who's feuding with whom? Which young people might be pairing off come spring? All the mundane details that make up a life. But then, as the afternoon wears on and the light outside begins to dim toward another long night, the conversation turns to stories. This is what Vikings are famous for, after all. The sagas, the tales of gods and heroes, of distant lands and impossible adventures. These stories served so many purposes. They entertained, obviously, making the long dark evenings pass more quickly. They educated, teaching moral lessons and practical wisdom. They preserved history, keeping alive the memories of ancestors and important events. And they connected the Vikings to something larger than themselves, to a mythological framework that gave meaning to their harsh existence. The one thing you gotta understand is that these stories weren't just entertainment like watching a movie. They were participatory, interactive. The storyteller might start the tale, but others would jump in, adding details, correcting errors, debating interpretations. The children would listen with rapt attention, their imaginations firing as they pictured the scenes being described. This was better than any TV show, more immersive than any video game, because it was happening right there in front of them, brought to life by voices and gestures and the flickering firelight that made shadows dance on the walls. Gunnar, who's known as a particularly good storyteller, begins to speak. His voice drops into that special cadence that storytellers use, a rhythm that's almost musical. He tells the story of Thor's journey to Utgard, how the mighty god of thunder was tricked and humbled, how even the strongest can be deceived. The children lean forward, eyes wide. They've heard this story before, probably dozens of times, but it never gets old. The adults, too, are listening, though they smile at familiar parts, mouthing along with particularly memorable lines. Here's something that might surprise you. While the men were famous for their raids and explorations, Viking women had a level of power and autonomy that was unusual for the time period. Astrid, for instance, holds the keys to the household stores. She decides when to open a new barrel of salted fish or when to use the last of the honey. Bjorn would no more make these decisions without her input than he would sail a ship without a rudder. Women could own property, initiate divorce, and even, in some cases, conduct business or serve as religious leaders. The notion that Viking society was entirely patriarchal is a myth that's been perpetuated by people who didn't dig deeply enough into the historical record. As the stories continue and the evening deepens, someone suggests singing. Vikings loved music, and winter evenings were often filled with songs. These weren't complicated compositions. No one was writing symphonies or operas, but they were deeply felt, passed down through generations. Songs about the sea and the sky, about love and loss, about the changing seasons and the eternal cycle of life and death. The singing serves another purpose too. It warms the body. Singing requires deep breathing, which gets the blood flowing, and the communal activity raises everyone's spirits. By the time Gunnar and his family prepare to leave, it's full dark outside. The temperature has dropped even further, and the walk back to their long house, though short, will be challenging. But they can't stay. They have their own animals to tend, their own fire to maintain. They bundle up again, transforming from recognizable humans into those ambiguous walking bundles of cloth. Promises are made to visit again soon, and then they're gone, the door opening and closing quickly. That rush of cold air, a sharp reminder of what lurks just beyond the walls. Now the longhouse settles into its evening routine. The family eats again, a heavier meal this time. Stew made from dried meat and root vegetables that have been stored in the underground cellar. Bread, dense and heavy, made from whatever grains they have left. More milk, more cheese. The sheer quantity of food might shock a modern person. But when you're burning calories constantly, just to stay warm, you need to replace them constantly. After the meal, before sleep, there's one more important task. Bjorn and Eric bank the fire in the Langeld. This is a skill in itself, something that has to be learned through experience. You can't just let the fire burn down on its own, because it might go out completely. But you can't feed it too much either, because it might flare up in the night and consume too much wood, leaving you short of fuel for tomorrow. So you arrange the coals and add just the right amount of wood, positioned in just the right way, so that the fire will burn slowly and steadily through the night, requiring minimal attention. The family prepares for sleep, and this is when the Viking approach to staying warm really shines. They don't each go to their own separate beds. That would be wasteful of both space and heat. Instead, the sleeping arrangements are communal. The family sleeps together on raised platforms that line the walls of the longhouse. These platforms, called benches, though they're really more like beds, are another clever bit of engineering. By raising the sleeping area off the floor, the Vikings avoid the coldest air, which settles at ground level. The platforms are topped with thick layers of straw or heather, which provides both cushioning and insulation. Over this go layers of furs and wool blankets. But the real key is the way the family sleeps. Together, closely. Body heat is shared, creating a microclimate under the blankets that's remarkably warm. The parents sleep on the outside, their bodies forming a protective barrier for the children who sleep in the middle. Everyone wears their base layers to bed. You don't sleep naked in a Viking longhouse. That would be suicidal. But the multiple layers of wool and fur and bodies together create a cocoon that stays comfortable through even the coldest night. As you lie here listening to this story, perhaps you're under your own blankets, warm and comfortable in a heated room. It's worth taking a moment to appreciate just how far humanity has come, but also to recognize the ingenuity of our ancestors. They didn't have the technology we have, but they had something else, a deep, intimate knowledge of their environment and how to work with it rather than against it. Speaking of appreciation, if you're finding this story relaxing and helpful for sleep, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss future journeys through history. Your support helps us create more content like this. And hey, there are so many more fascinating stories to explore. The longhouse grows quiet as the family settles into sleep. The only sounds now are breathing, the occasional crackle and pop from the Langeld, and the ever-present wind outside. Inside this wooden cocoon, insulated by layers of wool and earth and thatch, the family is safe. The temperature inside the sleeping area under the blankets is probably somewhere in the 70s, remarkably comfortable, given that just a few feet away, beyond the walls, the temperature is below zero and still dropping. Hours pass. The night deepens. In the very darkest part of the night, when even the faint glow from the Langeld has dimmed to almost nothing, Bjorn wakes. This is part of his routine, something he does every night without fail. He slips out from under the blankets, and the cold hits him immediately. Even inside the longhouse, the temperature has dropped. He moves quickly to the Langeld, his eyes so adjusted to the darkness that he can navigate easily. He adds wood to the fire, not much, just enough to keep it going until morning. The wood catches, flames flicker up briefly, and the temperature in the longhouse begins to rise slightly. Bjorn stands there for a moment, warming his hands, looking around at his domain. This is his kingdom. Not grand, not luxurious by any standard, but it's his. He built much of it with his own hands, with help from his neighbors and family. These walls have kept his family alive through 10 winters now. The roof has kept out rain and snow. The Langeld has never gone out completely, not once. That's something to be proud of, a real accomplishment in a world where a single mistake could mean death. Bjorn thinks about the summer, as he often does on these cold winter nights. In the summer, the sun barely sets, bathing the land in endless twilight. The fields turn green, and crops grow with astonishing speed, making up for the short growing season with nearly round-the-clock photosynthesis. The sea calms enough for fishing and trading. Young men go Viking, sailing to other lands to trade or raid, or sometimes both. Bjorn went Viking in his youth. He sailed to England and Francia, saw cities and cathedrals, fought in battles that made his blood sing. But those days are behind him now. He's a family man, a farmer, a survivor. He adds one more piece of wood to the fire, then returns to the sleeping platform. He slides back under the blankets, carefully so as not to wake Astrid, though she stirs slightly and murmurs something in her sleep. Within minutes, lulled by the warmth and the rhythmic breathing of his family, Bjorn is asleep again. Morning comes slowly at this latitude. The sun takes its time climbing above the horizon. And even when it does, it's more of a suggestion of daylight than the real thing. But the family wakes because they've been conditioned by years of routine. There's no sleeping in during a Viking winter. Every hour of potential daylight is precious, and work can't wait. Today's tasks are different from yesterday's, but no less important. Astrid needs to do laundry, which is a monumental undertaking in winter. You can't just throw clothes in a machine and press a button. First, snow has to be melted for water. A lot of snow because laundry takes a lot of water. Then the water has to be heated in large pots placed near the langold. The clothes are scrubbed with harsh lye soap, soap that the Vikings made themselves from wood ash and animal fat. It's brutal on the hands, but it gets things clean. The clothes are then rinsed, wrung out by hand, and hung to dry on lines strung near the langold. Drying clothes in winter is its own challenge. If you hang them outside, they'll freeze solid in minutes, so they have to be dried indoors, which adds moisture to the air and takes up valuable space. But it has to be done. You can't wear the same clothes continuously for months on end without washing them. Well, you could, but you'd get sick. The Vikings understood cleanliness in a way that medieval Europeans often didn't. They bathed regularly, even in winter, heating water and washing in wooden tubs. They combed their hair and beards, took pride in their appearance. This wasn't vanity, it was hygiene, another survival strategy. While Astrid manages the laundry with help from the younger children, Bjorn and Eric are tackling a different project. One of the storage sheds, a small building separate from the main longhouse, has developed a problem. Mice have gotten in and are eating the stored grain. Now, you might think, so what, it's just mice. But in winter, every mouthful of grain is precious. The family has calculated exactly how much food they need to make it to spring, and there's not a lot of margin for error. If the mice eat too much, the family might starve before the first harvest comes in. So father and son spend the morning mouse-proofing the shed. They fill holes with clay mixed with straw. They set traps, simple wooden devices that snap shut when triggered. They move the grain sacks to a different part of the shed, off the floor and onto a raised platform. It's tedious work, cold work because the shed isn't heated, but it's necessary. Midday brings another meal, and then something different. Today is the day Bjorn has set aside for weapon maintenance. This is work he takes seriously. His axe, his spear, his shield. These aren't decorations or historical curiosities. They're tools that his life might depend on. Raiders don't stop raiding just because it's winter. Feuds don't pause for the cold. And predators, both human and animal, are often more dangerous in winter when food is scarce and desperation runs high. Bjorn sits near the langold, with his weapons laid out before him. The axe is his pride and joy, a beautifully balanced weapon with a steel head that he traded for dearly. The steel came from the east, carried along trade routes that stretched all the way to Constantinople and beyond. The handle is ash wood, sanded smooth and treated with oil to prevent splitting. He examines every inch of it, looking for cracks, testing the head to make sure it's still firmly attached. He sharpens the blade with a whetstone, the rhythmic scraping sound filling the longhouse. This isn't just about keeping a sharp edge. This is meditation, a connection to generations of warriors who came before him. Eric watches his father work, learning. Next year, maybe the year after, Eric will have his own weapons to maintain. He'll be considered a man, old enough to fight, old enough to go Viking if he chooses. For now, he's still learning, absorbing knowledge like a sponge. His father doesn't explain much. The Vikings didn't have formal education in the way we think of it. Learning happened through observation and practice. You watched someone who knew what they were doing, and then you tried it yourself again and again until you got it right. The afternoon wears on. Outside, the brief daylight is already fading. Up here in the far north, during the dead of winter, you might get only 4 or 5 hours of real daylight, and even that's more twilight than the bright sunshine you'd see in summer. This perpetual darkness is another challenge that the Vikings had to manage. Humans need sunlight for both physical and mental health. Without it, you can develop vitamin D deficiency, depression, fatigue. The Vikings combated this partly through diet. Fatty fish, liver, eggs, all foods rich in vitamin D. They also stayed active, refusing to just huddle in their longhouses and wait for spring. Activity, both physical and mental, was essential for maintaining morale through the long, dark months. As evening approaches, there's a commotion outside. A neighbor comes running, or rather, stumbling through the snow, to bang urgently on the door. Bjorn opens it immediately, pulling the man inside. It's Thorvald, who lives 3 long houses down, and he's in a state of panic. His youngest child, a girl of maybe 4 years old, has developed a fever. She's hot to the touch, crying inconsolably, and Thorvald's wife is beside herself with worry. This is one of the great terrors of Viking life, something that haunts every parent. Illness in winter could be a death sentence. There were no antibiotics, no hospitals, no easy way to get help if things went truly wrong. The Vikings had healers, people who knew about herbs and remedies, who could set broken bones and treat wounds. But their options were limited, and many illnesses that we'd consider minor today could kill back then. Astrid doesn't hesitate. She's had 5 children, lost 2 in infancy, and she's nursed the survivors through countless childhood ailments. She gathers her supplies: herbs dried from last summer, clean cloths, a special tea made from willow bark that helps with fever and pain. She bundles up and follows Thorvald back to his lawn house, moving as quickly as the snow and darkness allow. Bjorn stays behind with the children, and this gives us a chance to explore another aspect of Viking winter survival: community medical knowledge. The Vikings didn't have doctors in the modern sense, but they had an impressive understanding of practical medicine. They knew that willow bark reduced fever and pain, though they didn't know it contained salicylic acid, the compound that we synthesize into aspirin. They knew that certain molds could prevent wounds from becoming infected, though they didn't understand antibiotics or bacteria. They knew that fresh vegetables prevented a wasting disease, though they didn't know about vitamin C and scurvy. This knowledge was hard-won, accumulated over generations through trial and error and careful observation. Astrid spends hours at Thorvald's longhouse. The little girl is indeed very sick, her body burning with fever, her breath coming fast and shallow. Astrid does what she can. She brews the willow bark tea and coaxes the child to drink it, just small sips at first. She bathes the girl's forehead with cool water, not too cold because that could send her into shock, but cool enough to help bring down the fever. She burns herbs that are supposed to purify the air, though whether this has any real medical effect is debatable. Mostly, she provides comfort and reassurance to the parents who are terrified. This right here is another crucial aspect of Viking survival that often gets overlooked: the psychological support, the way communities came together in times of crisis. Thorvald and his wife aren't alone in their fear. Astrid is there, experienced and calm, and her presence alone makes the situation feel more manageable. She tells them stories of her own children being sick and recovering. She prays to the gods, particularly to Air, the goddess of healing. Whether the gods listen or not is a matter of faith, but the act of praying gives the parents something to do, some sense of control in a situation where they're largely helpless. Hours pass. The fever begins to break, slowly at first, then more rapidly. The little girl's temperature drops, her breathing eases, and finally, blessedly, she falls into a natural sleep. Astrid can tell the difference between the fitful unconsciousness of high fever and real, healing sleep. This is real sleep. The crisis has passed, at least for now. The child will need care and monitoring for the next few days, but she's going to be okay. Thorvald and his wife are overcome with relief and gratitude. They try to give Astrid gifts, food from their stores, anything they can offer. But Astrid refuses. This isn't the kind of thing you pay for. This is what neighbors do for each other. She knows that if the situation were reversed, if one of her children were sick, Thorvald's wife would come without hesitation. That's how these communities survived. Not through rugged individualism, but through mutual support and interdependence. By the time Astrid makes her way back to her own longhouse, it's very late. The stars are out, brilliant against the black sky, so bright and numerous that they almost seem to give off a faint light. The northern lights are dancing too, ribbons of green and blue and occasionally red, shimmering across the heavens. The Vikings had stories about the aurora. Some said it was light reflecting off the shields of the Valkyries as they rode across the sky, choosing which warriors would die in battle. Others said it was a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the gods. Whatever its cause, and we now know it's caused by solar particles interacting with Earth's magnetic field, it's beautiful. One of the few compensations for living in such a harsh environment. Astrid pauses for a moment before entering her longhouse, just looking up at the sky. She's tired, tired, but there's a satisfaction too. She helped save a child's life tonight. That means something. In a world where death is always close, where winter tries its best to kill you every single day, preserving life is a victory. Inside, the family is asleep, all except Bjorn, who's been waiting up, tending the fire and worrying. He sees his wife's face and knows immediately that the child is going to be okay. They don't need to exchange words. After 20 years together, they can read each other like runestones. Astrid sheds her outer layers, warms herself by the Langeld for a few minutes, and then joins her family in the sleeping area. Within moments, lulled by exhaustion and warmth, she's deeply asleep. And if you're still listening to this, if you're finding yourself drifting along with these ancient rhythms, then go ahead and drop a comment telling me what you think. Have you learned something new about Viking life? Are there other historical topics you'd like to explore? Your engagement really does help this channel grow and helps other people discover these restful historical journeys. Days turn into weeks, and the weeks blend together in that strange way that time has when you're in survival mode. Every day is different in its details, but the same in its structure. Wake, tend the fire, eat, work, eat, sleep, repeat. It sounds monotonous, and in some ways it is, but monotony is better than chaos. Routine keeps you alive, but winter isn't just an endless gray blur. There are moments of brightness, times when life pushes through despite the cold. One of these moments comes about a month after the little girl's illness, when another neighbor announces that his wife is pregnant. This is cause for celebration, though tempered with caution. Pregnancy and childbirth are dangerous in any era, but especially so in Viking times. Many women died in childbirth, and many babies didn't survive their first year. Still, life goes on, and children are essential for the survival of the community. They're the future, the ones who'll carry on traditions and knowledge, the ones who'll take care of their parents in old age. The settlement comes together to celebrate the announcement. This gathering is larger than the usual small visits between neighbors. Multiple families converge on the longhouse of the expectant couple. bringing food and drink to share. The longhouse becomes crowded, packed with bodies, and this serves a practical purpose beyond socialization. All those people generate heat. With 30 or 40 people in one longhouse, the temperature rises significantly. It's almost uncomfortable near the Langold, and people shed their outer layers, working down to just their inner tunics. There's feasting, as much as winter supplies allow. Roasted meat, precious because it's using up stored resources. But this is a special occasion. Fresh bread, beer that's been carefully hoarded for celebrations, just like this. There's music and dancing, though in the confined space of the longhouse, the dancing is more rhythmic swaying and stomping. The children run wild, excited by the unusual event, their laughter filling the space. And there's storytelling, always storytelling. But tonight, the stories are different. They're not the grand sagas of gods and heroes. Instead, people tell personal stories, memories of their own childbirths, funny anecdotes about children doing ridiculous things, advice for the expectant parents. These stories serve to weave the new child into the fabric of the community, even before the baby is born. The child becomes real, anticipated, already loved. One of the older women, a grandmother several times over, tells a story about surviving childbirth during a particularly harsh winter storm. Her labor started just as a blizzard hit, and the midwife couldn't make it through the snow. She had to rely on her husband and her own mother, neither of whom had any real experience with delivering babies. But they figured it out, step by step, and both mother and Babel survived. The moral of the story is clear. You do what you have to do, and you rely on the people around you. This is the Viking way. As the night wears on and people begin to drift back to their own longhouses, there's a feeling of renewal in the air. Yes, winter is hard. Yes, people die. But life continues. Children are born. Love persists. Communities endure. This is the ultimate victory over winter. Not just surviving it, but maintaining humanity and hope through the darkest times. The next morning, Bjorn wakes with a slight headache, the result of drinking more beer than usual. But there's work to be done, hangover or not. Today, he and Eric are going to check the fishing nets that are set under the ice. Yes, you read that right. The Vikings fished through the ice. Another survival technique that shows their ingenuity. The technique works like this. Early in the winter, before the ice gets too thick, you cut a series of holes in the ice of a lake or quiet bay. You thread a rope through these holes, running it beneath the ice from one hole to the next. This is harder than it sounds and involves a lot of pulls and patience, and occasionally falling through thin ice, which is every bit as dangerous as it sounds. Once the rope is in place, you attach nets to it. The nets hang beneath the ice, and fish, swimming in the dark water below, get caught in them. Every few days, you pull up the nets using the rope, harvest whatever fish you've caught, and then lower the nets again. Bjorn and Eric bundle up and make their way to the lake, which is about a quarter mile from the settlement. The walk is brutal. The wind has picked up again, and even with their faces wrapped, the cold finds ways to sneak through, burning their cheeks and making their eyes water. By the time they reach the first ice hole, they're both breathing hard, their breath freezing in their beards and face wrappings, creating little crystals of ice. The ice hole has partially frozen over, as it does every day. Bjorn uses an ice axe to clear it, chopping through several inches of new ice to reach the dark water below. He pulls on the rope, hand over hand, and the net begins to emerge from beneath the ice. It's heavy, a good sign, and when they finally haul it up onto the ice, they can see why. There are half a dozen large fish, frozen almost solid in the moments since leaving the water, their scales glittering like jewels in the weak winter sunlight. This is a good catch, enough fish to feed the family for several days. Bjorn and Garrick are elated, grinning at each other despite the cold. They move on to the next hole and the next, checking all the nets. Not all of them have caught fish, but overall, it's a successful day. By the time they're done, they have nearly 20 fish, a real bounty. The walk back to the longhouse is easier, buoyed by success and the anticipation of fresh fish. Fresh protein is a treat in winter, when most of the diet consists of dried, salted, or smoked foods. Tonight, there will be fresh fish for dinner, fried in butter if Astrid can spare it, or boiled in a stew if she can't. Either way, it'll be delicious. But here's something interesting that demonstrates just how different Viking life was from ours. When Bjorn and Eric return with their catch, they don't keep it all for themselves. Before they even enter their own longhouse, Bjorn divides the fish into portions and sends Eric to deliver some to several other families. This isn't charity exactly, and it's not entirely altruistic either. It's insurance. Today, Bjorn's family has abundance. Tomorrow, another family might be the one with a good catch or a successful hunt. By sharing now, Bjorn creates an obligation, an expectation that when times are lean for his family, others will share with them. This system of reciprocal giving bound Viking communities together and helped ensure that no one starved while their neighbor feasted. The fresh fish does indeed make for an excellent dinner that night. The family eats until they're almost uncomfortably full, savoring the delicate flavor and tender texture. Little Freya announces that this is the best dinner ever, and while her enthusiasm might be exaggerated, it's clear that everyone's spirits are lifted. Good food does that, especially in the depths of winter when morale can sink as low as the temperatures. After dinner, Astrid brings out a project she's been working on in secret. It's a tapestry, a small one, but intricately designed. She's been weaving it during the daylight hours when the children are occupied with other tasks, and now it's finally complete. The tapestry depicts a scene from Norse mythology: Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, flying over the world. The detail is incredible, every feather carefully rendered in different shades of wool. The ravens' eyes seeming almost alive in the firelight. This tapestry isn't just decoration. It's art, yes, but it's also a teaching tool, a way to pass down stories and beliefs. The children gather around to admire it, and Astrid tells them the story of Odin's ravens, how they fly around the world each day, seeing everything, and then return to whisper news in the gods' ears. The names Hugin and Munin mean thought and memory, and they represent the power of the mind to travel beyond the body, to learn and remember and understand. Stories like this, woven into tapestries or carved into wood or simply spoken aloud, were how Vikings passed down their culture. They didn't have books, at least not in the way we think of them. They had runes, a writing system, but it was primarily used for short inscriptions on stone or wood, not for recording long texts. Most knowledge was oral, memorized and recited, and this meant that every storyteller, every parent, every elder was a living library. If they died without passing on their knowledge, that knowledge died with them. This makes you think about the fragility of cultures, doesn't it? How much has been lost over the centuries? Stories and songs and techniques that vanished when the last person who knew them passed away. But it also speaks to the incredible power of human memory and oral tradition. The stories that Vikings told their children around the Langold, those stories survived, passed down generation after generation, eventually written down centuries later in the Icelandic sagas. We can still read them today, still connect with people who lived over 1,000 years ago, because they took the time to tell stories to their children. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Viking winter survival and culture, do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps the algorithm show this video to more people who might need a relaxing educational journey into the past. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. There are so many more stories to tell, so many historical mysteries to explore together. The weeks continue to pass. February arrives, though the Vikings didn't call it that. They had their own calendar, their own way of marking time. The year was divided into two main seasons, summer and winter. Winter stretched from October to April, and summer covered the rest of the year. Within these broad categories, there were more specific divisions marked by astronomical events, the behavior of animals, and changes in the weather. By the time we reach what we'd call mid-February, there are subtle signs that winter is loosening its grip, though it's still brutally cold and will be for weeks yet. The days are getting longer, noticeably so. The sun climbs a little higher in the sky each day. It's still not providing much warmth, but the psychological effect of more daylight is profound. People start to move with a little more energy, talk a little more about the future, rather than just focusing on getting through each day. This is also the time when supplies start to run low. The food that seemed so abundant back in October has been steadily depleted. Every family is calculating, counting sacks of grain and barrels of salted fish, wondering if they have enough to make it to the spring harvest. Most families do, because Viking planning and rationing was generally very good. But there's always uncertainty, always the worry that an unexpected problem could throw everything off balance. For Bjorn's family, the supplies are holding up well. Astrid is a master of household management, and she's been careful to make sure nothing is wasted. The scraps from meals are saved and turned into stew. Bones are boiled again and again to extract every bit of marrow and flavor. Nothing is thrown away if it can possibly be used for something. But there's one resource that's running seriously low: firewood. This is a critical problem, maybe the most critical problem a Viking household could face in late winter. They've been burning wood steadily since October, and even though Bjorn and his neighbors spent weeks cutting and stacking wood in the fall, the pile has shrunk to alarming levels. They need to get more wood, but here's the challenge. Trees don't just grow everywhere, and the good timber has been harvested from the nearby areas. To get more wood, they'll need to venture further from the settlement, into areas that are more difficult and dangerous to access in winter conditions. Bjorn discusses this problem with the other men in the settlement, and they decide to organize a group expedition. Strength in numbers, that's the key. If someone gets injured or lost, there are others to help. If they encounter predators or hostile humans, they can defend themselves. And perhaps most importantly, they can haul much more wood as a group than any individual could manage alone. The expedition is planned carefully. They choose a day when the weather forecast, such as it is, looks favorable. The Vikings were excellent at reading weather signs. They watched the behavior of animals, the appearance of clouds, the direction and strength of winds. They couldn't predict the weather with the accuracy of modern meteorology, but they were pretty good at knowing when a storm was coming or when conditions would be relatively safe. 8 men set out at first light, if you can call the dim gray pre-dawn first light. They're pulling sleds, simple but effective devices made from wood and bone, designed to glide over packed snow. Each man carries an axe, both for cutting wood and for defense if needed. They also carry food and water, because even though they're planning to return the same day, you never know what might happen. Vikings who went into the wilderness unprepared often didn't come back. The journey takes them through a landscape that's beautiful in an austere, dangerous way. Snow-covered hills roll away into the distance. Frozen streams wind through the valleys, their surfaces smooth and treacherous. Here and there, groves of pine trees stand dark against the white snow, and it's toward one of these groves that the men are heading. When they reach the trees, They work quickly and efficiently. They're not randomly chopping down trees. They're selective, choosing trees that are already dead or dying, trees that are the right size and type. Pine is good for quick-burning fires, but birch and oak are better for the Langeld because they burn longer and hotter. The men fell trees with their axes, the sound of chopping echoing through the cold air. They trim branches and cut the trunks into manageable lengths that can be loaded onto the sleds. It's hard, physical labor, the kind that makes you sweat even in sub-zero temperatures. The men work steadily for hours, breaking only occasionally to eat and rest. By mid-afternoon, the sleds are piled high with wood, more than they could possibly have carried individually. Now comes the hard part, dragging the loaded sleds back to the settlement. The return journey is grueling. The sleds are heavy, and even though snow provides a relatively smooth surface to slide them across, it still takes tremendous effort. The men take turns in the front positions where the pulling is hardest, rotating so that no one gets too exhausted. They sing working songs, rhythmic chants that help coordinate their efforts and keep their spirits up. These songs are simple, repetitive, designed to match the rhythm of walking and pulling. They're not about anything profound, just encouraging each other to keep going, reminding each other that warmth and rest await them at home. By the time they reach the settlement, it's nearly dark and they're all exhausted, but they've succeeded. They've brought back enough wood to keep their households going for another month or more. The wood is divided among the families, each getting a share proportional to the number of people in their household. This fairness in distribution is crucial for maintaining community cohesion. If anyone felt they were being cheated or taken advantage of, the social bonds that held the settlement together would fray. That night, Bjorn is so tired he can barely eat his dinner. His muscles ache, his hands are blistered despite his calluses, and he's looking forward to nothing more than sleep. But before he sleeps, he takes a moment to appreciate what they've accomplished. They've pushed back against winter, bought themselves more time, ensured their family's survival for a little while longer. In the grand scheme of human history, it might not seem like much. They didn't build a cathedral or paint a masterpiece or make a scientific discovery, but they survived, and that's its own kind of greatness. As March approaches, the character of winter begins to shift. It's still cold, don't get me wrong. There are still storms and dangerous conditions. But there's a quality to the light that's different, a sense of anticipation in the air. The snow starts to get a bit wetter, heavier. Icicles form on the edges of roofs and then drip, drip, drip during the warmest part of the day. These are tiny signs, barely noticeable, but to people who've been waiting months for spring, they're like trumpet calls announcing victory. The animals sense it too. The chickens, who've been mostly dormant through the winter, start moving around more, scratching at their bedding with renewed vigor. The cows become restless, their milk production beginning to increase as their bodies prepare for calving season. And outside, though it's hard to see them against the snow, small animals are beginning to stir. Rabbits venture out more frequently. Birds that have been silent all winter start making tentative calls. For the children, this emerging spring brings a new freedom. They've been cooped up inside for months, only venturing out for brief periods when absolutely necessary. But now, as the days grow longer and slightly warmer, they're allowed outside for longer stretches. They play in the snow, building structures, and having snowball fights, burning off energy that's been pent up all winter. Their laughter rings through the settlement, a sound that's been largely absent during the darkest months. Eric, who's been on the verge of manhood all winter, starts to feel the pull of the wider world. He talks constantly about the summer, about going Viking with his father, about seeing new lands and having adventures. Bjorn listens with a mixture of pride and concern. He remembers being that age, remembers the hunger for adventure, the sense that the world was full of possibilities. But he also remembers the dangers, the friends who didn't come back from raids, the storms that swallowed ships whole. He wants to protect his son, but he also knows he can't. Eric will make his own choices, walk his own path. One particularly memorable day in early March, the temperature rises above freezing for the first time in months. It's only briefly, only for a few hours in the middle of the day, but it's enough. Snow on south-facing roofs begins to melt, creating a steady dripping sound that's almost musical. People emerge from their longhouses, faces turn toward the sun like flowers, soaking up the weak but warming rays. There's a collective exhale, a release of tension that's been building for half a year. But winter isn't done yet. A few days after that teasing glimpse of warmth, a massive storm rolls in. It's one of the worst storms of the entire season, a final flexing of winter's muscles. The snow falls so thick, you can't see more than a few feet in any direction. The wind howls like a living thing, shaking the longhouses and piling snow into drifts that reach halfway up the walls. The temperature plummets again, and for 2 days, no one can leave their homes at all. They're trapped inside, hoping that their stores hold out, that their roofs don't collapse under the weight of snow, that the storm passes before any real catastrophe occurs. During the storm, the family hunkers down. They've been through this before. They know what to do. They keep the Lengold burning steadily. They eat sparingly, because who knows how long the storm might last. They tell stories and work on indoor tasks, and try not to think too hard about the howling darkness outside. At one point, the wind is so strong that it finds gaps in the walls and doors, creating whistling drafts that send smoke swirling through the longhouse in strange patterns. Bjorn and Eric stuff these gaps with cloth and straw, anything to keep the warmth in and the cold out. A storm finally breaks on the 3rd day. The wind dies down, the snow stops falling, and an eerie silence descends. When the family finally ventures outside, they find a transformed landscape. Snow has buried everything. Paths that were clear before have completely disappeared. Several of the smaller outbuildings are buried almost to their roofs, but the longhouses have held, and as the settlers check on each other, they discover that everyone has survived. It could have been so much worse. The next week is spent digging out, clearing paths, checking for damage. It's exhausting work, but there's also a sense of camaraderie and even humor about it. The worst of winter has thrown everything it has at them, and they're still standing. They've won. Spring might still be weeks away, but the psychological victory is complete. If you've stuck with this story through storms and cold, through the daily grind of Viking survival, then you're exactly the kind of person who appreciates deep, immersive historical content. Make sure you're subscribed to Dreamless Timelines, and let me know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like to explore. Your suggestions help shape future content, and I love hearing from you. As March progresses into April, the signs of spring become undeniable. The sun is noticeably warmer now. Snow melts during the day, though it still freezes again at night. The settlement is surrounded by the sound of running water as snowmelt creates streams and rivulets everywhere. The ice on the lake begins to break up, creating spectacular displays as huge sheets of ice crack and shift. Birds appear, migrants returning from the south, and their songs fill the air. The family's routine begins to shift accordingly. The Langeld is allowed to burn lower now during the day, since the temperature inside the longhouse is comfortable without as much supplemental heat. The doors and air vents are opened wider, allowing fresh air to circulate through the space that's been sealed up for so many months. The smell of the longhouse changes, from that distinctive winter scent of smoke and bodies and wool to something fresher, cleaner. Astrid takes advantage of the improving weather to do a massive spring cleaning. This is no small undertaking. The floor rushes, which have been accumulating for months, are completely removed and replaced with fresh material. The old rushes are taken outside and burned, a satisfying blaze that the whole settlement can smell. The walls are scrubbed down, removing months of accumulated smoke residue. The sleeping platforms are aired out, the furs and blankets taken outside and beaten to remove dust and parasites. Every single possession the family owns is taken outside, inspected, cleaned, and either put back or designated for repair or disposal. This spring cleaning serves multiple purposes beyond just tidiness. It's a way of marking the transition from winter to summer, a ritual that signals survival and renewal. It's also necessary from a health standpoint. Parasites, like lice and fleas, can become real problems in close quarters during winter, and this thorough cleaning helps control them. And there's a psychological benefit too. A clean, fresh home lifts spirits and helps people transition from the survival mentality of winter to the productive mentality of summer. The men, meanwhile, turn their attention to outdoor tasks that have been impossible during the deepest winter. Fences need repair, roofs need patching, tools need to be checked and maintained. The ships, which have been pulled up onto shore and covered for the winter, need to be uncovered and inspected. Any damage from ice and weather needs to be fixed before the sailing season can begin. Bjorn and Eric spend several days working on their family's ship. It's not a massive longship of the type you see in movies, designed for raids and carrying dozens of warriors. It's a carve, a smaller vessel designed for coastal trading and fishing, but it's still a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, clinker-built, with overlapping planks that give it both strength and flexibility. The ship is about 30 feet long, with a single mast and a square sail currently stored in the longhouse. They inspect every inch of the hull, looking for cracks or rot. They find a few problem areas, spots where water has gotten in and started to cause damage. These areas are carefully cut out and replaced with new wood, shaped to fit perfectly and sealed with tar. The sail is brought out and examined. It's made of wool, woven into a tight weave and then treated with fat and ochre to make it water resistant. There's a small tear that Astrid will need to repair, and some of the lines need replacing, but overall, the ship is in good condition. As they work, Bjorn talks to Eric about sailing, passing down knowledge just as his father passed it down to him. He explains how to read the wind and waves, how to navigate by the sun and stars, how to recognize weather patterns. He talks about the dangers of the sea, the way a storm can rise up seemingly from nowhere, the terror of being caught far from shore in bad weather. But he also talks about the joy of sailing, the feeling of freedom as the wind fills your sail and the ship leaps forward across the waves. Eric drinks it all in, asking questions, offering to help with every task. He's eager to prove himself, to show that he's ready for the adventures that summer will bring. And watching him, Bjorn feels a complex mix of emotions. Pride in his son's enthusiasm and capability, anxiety about the dangers that await, a strange sadness that his child is growing up and will soon be making his own way in the world. These are universal feelings experienced by parents in every culture throughout history. One morning in mid-April, Astrid wakes to a sound she hasn't heard in months. Rain. Not snow, not sleet, but actual rain, falling steadily on the roof of the longhouse. She lies there for a moment, just listening, and she feels something inside her chest loosen. Rain means spring is truly here. Winter is finally, definitively over. She rises and goes to the door, opening it to look outside. The sight that greets her is almost shocking after so many months of white. The ground is visible, muddy and brown, but visible. Green is starting to appear in sheltered spots, tiny shoots of grass pushing up toward the sun. The rain is washing away the last remnants of snow, revealing the world beneath. Over the next few weeks, the transformation accelerates. The fields, which have been frozen and barren, suddenly explode with life. Grass grows so fast you can almost see it, fed by snowmelt and rain and the long hours of sunlight. Wildflowers appear, splashes of color against the brown and green. The trees, which have been skeletal all winter, begin to bud and then leaf out. The settlement becomes a hive of activity. Fields need to be plowed and planted. Vegetable gardens need to be prepared. The animals, which have been mostly confined during winter, need to be taken to summer pastures where they can graze on fresh grass. There are fish to catch, now that the waters are open and the fish are running. There are repairs and improvements to make to buildings and equipment. And there are trades to arrange, visits to make to other settlements, news to exchange. For the children, summer is a time of relative freedom. They still have chores, of course, but they're not trapped indoors. They can run and play, explore the countryside, swim in the lake once it warms up enough. Little Freya discovers flowers and becomes obsessed with them, picking bouquets and weaving them into her hair. Olaf starts following the older boys around, watching them practice with weapons and begging to be allowed to try. Eric is barely home at all, spending his days helping with the spring work, and his evenings hanging around with young people his own age, including a particular girl named Sigrid who's caught his attention. Astrid and Bjorn watch all of this with satisfaction. They've done it. They've kept their family alive through another winter, and now they're reaping the rewards. The food stores that seemed so dangerously low in March are being replenished with fresh fish and early vegetables. The herds are growing, with new calves and lambs being born almost daily. The future looks bright, at least for now. But even as they enjoy the summer, even as they revel in the warmth and light and abundance, there's a part of them that's always looking ahead. Summer won't last forever. In just a few months, the days will start getting shorter again. The first frost will come. And then it'll be time to prepare once more for winter's onslaught. This is the cycle that governs Viking life. The eternal rhythm of seasons that must be respected and prepared for. One evening in late May, when the sun is still high in the sky even though it's nearly midnight, the family gathers outside. This is one of the strangest and most wonderful aspects of life at this latitude. During the summer, the sun barely sets. Twilight can last for hours, and at the height of summer, there might not be any real darkness at all. It's the opposite of winter's endless night, and it's glorious. They sit together on the grass outside their longhouse, watching the sky slowly shift through shades of gold and pink and purple. They're not talking much, just enjoying each other's presence and the beauty of the evening. Astrid thinks about the winter they've just survived, all the challenges and dangers and moments of fear. She thinks about the little girl who almost died from fever, about the storms they weathered, about the constantly gnawing worry of whether their supplies would last. But more than that, she thinks about the moments of joy and connection, the stories told around the Lengold, the laughter of children playing, the satisfaction of a good day's work, the warmth of her husband's body next to hers on cold nights, the way the community came together to support each other. These are the things that make survival worthwhile, that transform mere existence into a life worth living. Bjorn is having similar thoughts. He's a practical man, not given to much introspection. but even he can recognize the significance of what they've accomplished. His family is healthy and happy. His home is strong. His reputation in the community is solid. He's provided for his people and protected them from harm. In Viking culture, this is the measure of a man, and by that measure, Bjorn can hold his head high. Eric, sitting slightly apart from his parents in that way that teenagers do, is thinking about the future. He's imagining himself on a ship, sailing to distant lands. Maybe he'll go to England and see the great cities there. Maybe he'll go east, following the rivers deep into the continental interior, trading with peoples whose languages and customs are completely foreign. Or maybe, and this thought makes his heart beat faster, maybe he'll go west into the unknown ocean, seeking the lands that rumors speak of. But for now, for this perfect evening in late May, all of that is in the future. For now, there's just this moment, this family, this hard-won peace. The sun touches the horizon and then begins to climb again, never fully setting. The sky remains light, painted in shades that seem almost unreal. Somewhere in the distance, a bird calls. The sound of water running is constant. The streams still swollen with snowmelt. This is the reward for surviving winter. Not just the physical comfort of warmth and food, though those are certainly welcome, but this sense of renewal, of possibility, of life triumphant over death. The Vikings understood something that modern people sometimes forget, that hardship makes joy sweeter, that survival, earned, is more precious than comfort given freely. Now, we've been on this journey for quite a while, and if you're still here, still listening, still traveling through time with me, then I want to take a moment to thank you. Your attention is a gift, and I don't take it lightly. If you found this exploration of Viking winter survival interesting and relaxing, please consider subscribing to Dreamless Timelines. There are so many more stories to tell, so many fascinating corners of history to explore together, and drop a comment letting me know what you think. Did you learn something new? Is there a particular aspect of Viking life you'd like to know more about? Your feedback shapes the content I create. As summer progresses, the settlement prepares for the traveling season. This is when Vikings do their Viking, you might say. Groups of young men prepare to go raiding or trading, depending on their inclinations and opportunities. Ships are loaded with trade goods, furs and amber, walrus ivory and dried fish, slaves captured in raids, and valuable metals. These expeditions can last months, and they're always risky. Not everyone who sails away in summer returns in the fall. Bjorn has decided not to go raiding this year. He's getting older, and the life of a raider is for young men with fast reflexes and fearless hearts. But Eric is determined to go, and after much discussion, Bjorn has agreed to let him join an expedition. Not as a warrior, not yet, but as a crew member, learning the ropes and proving himself. It's a compromise that neither of them is entirely happy with, but it's the best they can do. The day Eric is set to leave is bittersweet for the whole family. Astrid has prepared his clothes with extra care, making sure every seam is strong, every piece of wool is thick and warm. She's packed food for him, knowing that the ship will have its own supplies, but wanting to give her son something from home to sustain him. She doesn't cry, because Viking women don't cry, or at least they don't cry where anyone can see them. But her eyes are bright, and her hugs are fierce. Bjorn walks with Eric down to the shore where the ship is waiting. The crew is already assembling, about 15 men and boys, ranging in age from Eric's 13 years to grizzled veterans in their 40s. The ship itself looks small and fragile for the journey ahead, but Bjorn knows better. These vessels are marvels of engineering, capable of crossing open ocean or navigating shallow rivers with equal ease. Father and son stand together for a moment, looking at the ship and the sea beyond. Bjorn wants to say something profound, something that will protect his son and guide him through whatever challenges lie ahead. But the words don't come. So instead, he just grips Eric's shoulder and says, "Be smart, be brave, come home." Eric nods, understanding everything his father isn't saying. Then he turns and climbs aboard the ship, taking his place among the crew. The ship is pushed off from shore. Oars are deployed, and slowly it begins to move out into the bay. Bjorn watches until the ship is just a speck on the horizon, and then he turns and walks back to the longhouse. Astrid is there, keeping busy with work, because that's how you deal with worry. The younger children sense that something significant has happened, but they don't fully understand what. They know their brother is gone, but they think he'll be back soon, maybe tomorrow or the day after. They don't understand that it might be months, or that there's a real possibility he might not come back at all. Bjorn and Astrid understand though, and it casts a shadow over the sunny summer days. But life goes on because it has to. Fields need tending, animals need care, and there are still 2 children at home who need raising. Bjorn throws himself into work, taking on extra tasks to keep his mind occupied. He helps neighbors with their harvests, repairs equipment, goes fishing nearly every day. Astrid does the same, working on massive weaving projects, preparing and preserving food for the next winter, teaching Freya all the skills she'll need as a woman. The summer passes in this way, busy and productive, but with an undercurrent of anxiety. News occasionally arrives from other settlements, travelers bringing word of raids and battles, successful trades and ships that have been lost. Every time someone arrives with news, Bjorn and Astrid listen intently, hoping for some word of Eric, but there's nothing. The ship he's on has vanished into the vastness of the world. Then, one evening in late August, when the sun is finally setting at a reasonable hour again, and there's a chill in the air that whispers of the coming autumn, a shout goes up from the settlement's lookout. A ship has been spotted, coming from the south. The whole settlement turns out to watch as the ship approaches, trying to identify it. Is it their ship, the one that left with their young people? Or is it strangers, possibly hostile? As the ship draws closer, recognition dawns. It's their ship, or at least it was their ship. It looks different now, lower in the water, which suggests it's heavily loaded with cargo. The sail is torn and has been patched, and there seem to be fewer people on board than when it left. Bjorn's heart clenches. Where is Eric? Is he one of the shapes he can see moving on the deck, or is he one of the missing? The ship beaches, and the crew jumps out to pull it up onto shore. And there, yes, thank the gods, there's Eric. He's different though. He's tanned dark brown from months in the sun, and he's grown, gained muscle and height. There's a confidence to his movements that wasn't there before. He's crossed a threshold, gone out as a boy, and come back something more than a boy, if not quite yet a man. The reunion is joyful, with families crowding around the returned voyagers, asking questions, exclaiming over the trade goods that are being unloaded. There's silver, lots of it, and fine cloth, and weapons of a quality that can't be made locally. There are stories too, stories of places seen and people met, of storms weathered and dangers overcome. But there are gaps in the crew. 3 young men didn't make it back. One was killed in a fight. One was lost at sea during a storm, and one decided to stay in a foreign land with a woman he'd met. For the families of the dead, this homecoming is agony. They knew the risks when they let their sons go, but knowing doesn't make the loss any easier to bear. The settlement will grieve for these lost young men, honor their memories, and support their families through the hard times ahead. That night, after the initial excitement has died down and most people have returned to their homes, Eric sits with his family around the Langeld. The fire is smaller than it will be in a few months, but it's there, always there, the heart of the home. He tells his stories, and his family listens with fascination. He describes cities larger than they can imagine, with stone buildings and crowds of thousands. He talks about sailing through storms that threaten to tear the ship apart, about the terror and exhilaration of combat, about the strange foods and customs of foreign peoples. Astrid and Bjorn listen, proud and grateful and more than a little awed by what their son has become. Freya and Olaf hang on every word, their imaginations firing. For them, Eric has become a hero out of the sagas, someone who's done the impossible and lived to tell about it. The family dynamic has shifted. Eric isn't a child anymore, and they all know it. He's a full member of the community now, someone who's proven himself and earned respect. The days continue to shorten as summer fades into autumn. The harvest season begins, and it's all hands on deck to bring in the crops before the weather turns. The Vikings grow barley and oats primarily, crops that can handle the short growing season and cool temperatures. They also grow vegetables, turnips and carrots, onions and cabbage, peas and beans. Every plant that survives to harvest is precious. The difference between plenty and hunger in the months ahead. The harvest is back-breaking work, dawn to dusk labor in the fields. Everyone helps, from the oldest elders who can still move to the youngest children capable of holding a basket. They cut the grain with sickles, bundle it into sheaves, and carry it to storage buildings. They dig up root vegetables and pile them in underground cellars where they'll stay cool and relatively fresh through the winter. They preserve everything they can, pickling cabbage into sauerkraut, drying fish and meat, making cheese from the abundant summer milk. As September turns to October, the first frosts come. They're light at first, just a thin layer of ice on standing water and a crispness to the air in the morning. But they're a warning, a reminder that winter is coming and preparation needs to be complete. The animals that have been out on summer pasture need to be brought back. The last of the hay needs to be cut and stored. Any repairs that absolutely must be done before winter need to be finished now. Bjorn and Eric, working together now as equals rather than father and child, spend long days cutting firewood. They venture into the forest with axes and saw, felling trees and cutting them into manageable pieces. The wood is stacked in careful rows near the longhouse, oriented to allow air circulation so it will continue to dry. They're building an even larger supply than usual because Eric has brought back silver from his voyage. And with that silver, Bjorn was able to trade for additional food stores. More food means they can be more generous with the fire, keeping the longhouse a bit warmer and more comfortable. The community comes together for one last big celebration before winter locks everything down. It's a harvest feast, a chance to eat and drink and be merry before the lean times begin. There's roasted meat, fresh vegetables, bread made from the new grain. There's beer and mead, music and dancing. The stories told tonight are of the summer just past, of Eric's adventures and the successful harvest, and all the good fortune the settlement has enjoyed. But underlying the celebration is the knowledge that this is it, the last hurrah before winter. Tomorrow, or the next day, or next week, the serious snow will start falling. The temperatures will plummet, and once again, survival will become the primary focus of daily life. The cycle continues, endless and inexorable. As the feast winds down and people begin drifting back to their longhouses, Bjorn stands outside for a moment, looking up at the stars. They're brilliant tonight, so clear and bright they seem close enough to touch. The northern lights are dancing too, a display of green and blue that shimmers across the heavens. He thinks about the year that's passed, the winter survived, and the summer enjoyed. He thinks about his son, grown and changed. He thinks about the winter to come and all the challenges it will bring. but mostly he thinks about how lucky he is. Lucky to be alive in this particular time and place. Lucky to have a family and a home. Lucky to be part of a community that supports each other through thick and thin. The Viking life is hard, no question about it, but it's also rich and meaningful in ways that are difficult to articulate. There's a satisfaction in overcoming challenges, in surviving through your own skills and strength and determination. There's joy in the simple things: a warm fire on a cold night, a good meal shared with family, the laughter of children, the return of spring after a long winter. He takes a deep breath of the cold air, filling his lungs, and then turns to go back inside. Astrid is waiting for him, and the Langold needs tending. And tomorrow there will be work to do. Always work to do. But that's okay. Work gives life structure and meaning. And when winter comes, as it surely will, he'll be ready. His family will be ready. They've done this before, and they'll do it again. Inside the longhouse, the family is preparing for bed. The routine is so familiar now, worn smooth by repetition. Layer on the sleeping platforms, bodies close together for warmth. Blankets and furs piled on top. The Langle burning low but steady, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The wind beginning to pick up outside, carrying the first hints of the storms to come. But inside, they're safe, warm, together. Little Freya asks for a story before sleep, as children have done since the beginning of time. Astrid obliges, telling the tale of Idun and her golden apples, how she kept the gods young, and how chaos ensued when she was taken away. It's a story about the importance of what seems ordinary, about how the everyday things we take for granted are often the most vital. Freya doesn't catch the deeper meanings, but someday she will. Someday she'll be the mother, telling stories to her own children, passing down the wisdom and knowledge of generations. The story ends. The children drift off to sleep, and the longhouse grows quiet. In the morning, the real work of winter survival will begin again. There will be animals to tend and food to prepare, tools to maintain and clothes to mend. There will be long, dark days and longer, darker nights. There will be storms and cold and all the challenges that winter brings. But there will also be stories and songs, laughter and love. The tight bonds of family and community that make life worth living. And that really is the secret of how Vikings survived Arctic winters without fireplaces. It wasn't just the clever engineering of their longhouses, though that was important. It wasn't just their careful planning and resource management, though that was crucial. It wasn't just their physical toughness and resilience, though they had those in spades. The real secret was community, family, the human connections that provided warmth no fire could match. They survived together, supporting each other, sharing knowledge and resources, telling stories that connected them to their past and gave them hope for the future. In our modern world, with our central heating and grocery stores and instant communication, it's easy to lose sight of these fundamental human needs. We can survive technically without community. We can live alone, interact with others only through screens, or do everything we need delivered to our doors. But survival isn't the same as living, and the Vikings knew that. They understood that humans are social creatures, that we need each other, not just for practical support, but for emotional and spiritual sustenance. As you drift off to sleep tonight, warm and comfortable in your modern bed, take a moment to appreciate both how far we've come and what we might have lost along the way. The Vikings would have marveled at our technology, at the ease with which we can survive winter, but they might also have pitied us for our isolation, for the way we've traded community for convenience. The story of Viking winter survival is ultimately a story about human ingenuity and adaptability. It's about people who looked at one of the harshest environments on Earth and said, "We're going to live here anyway." And they didn't just survive, they thrived. They built a civilization that would spread across Europe and beyond, leaving their mark on history in ways both large and small. But let's dig deeper into some of the specific techniques and technologies that made this survival possible, because there's so much more to learn. The Langold, that long central fire, was more sophisticated than it might first appear. The Vikings understood fire management in ways that most modern people never learn. They knew different woods produced different types of heat and smoke. Pine burned fast and hot but created a lot of smoke. Oak burned slowly and steadily with less smoke. Birch was somewhere in between and had the added benefit of bark that was excellent for starting fires. They understood the concept of thermal mass, though they wouldn't have called it that. The stones lining the Langeld weren't just there to contain the fire. They absorbed heat during the day when the fire was burning more actively, and then radiated that heat back throughout the night. This created a more stable temperature inside the longhouse, reducing the extremes between the hot periods when the fire was roaring and the cold periods when it was burning low. The Vikings also had an intimate understanding of insulation principles that modern science would take centuries to fully articulate. The turf and moss packed between the walls wasn't just random stuffing. Different materials were layered deliberately. Moss, which holds air particularly well, was placed in the middle layers. Earth and turf, which had more thermal mass, formed the outer layers. This created a composite insulation system that was remarkably effective. And here's something that's going to blow your mind. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Viking longhouses had a form of underfloor heating. Not anything like modern radiant heating, but a system where channels were dug beneath the floor and connected to the Langeld. Hot air and smoke would flow through these channels before venting outside, warming the floor from below. This technique wasn't universal, probably because it was labor-intensive to construct and maintain, but where it existed, it would have made a dramatic difference in comfort levels. The clothing the Vikings wore was also far more sophisticated than just throwing on layers of wool. They understood that different weaves of fabric had different properties. Loosely woven wool trapped more air and provided better insulation, but it was also more vulnerable to wind. Tightly woven wool was more wind-resistant, but less insulating. So they layered different weaves, using loose weaves for the middle layers where insulation was key, and tight weaves for outer layers that faced the wind. They also understood moisture management, though again, they wouldn't have used that term. Wool that got damp from sweat needed to be dried regularly, or it would lose its insulating properties. So clothes were designed to be easily removed and aired out. The Vikings had what we might call a mud room, an area near the entrance where wet or damp clothes could be hung to dry without bringing all that moisture into the main living area. Their footwear deserves special mention too. Viking boots weren't just leather bags tied around the feet. They were carefully constructed with multiple layers. The innermost layer, next to the foot, was often soft leather or fabric. Then came a layer of insulation, traditionally dried grass or moss, though sometimes wool or fur. Then came the outer layer of thick, water-resistant leather. The boots were tall, extending well up the calf. And they were secured with leather wrappings that not only kept them on, but also helped keep snow from getting inside. But even the best boots couldn't keep feet warm indefinitely in sub-zero temperatures. So the Vikings had strategies for that too. If you were going to be outside for an extended period, you periodically had to warm your feet. This could mean ducking into a building if one was nearby. Or if you were traveling, it might mean stopping to build a small fire. Vikings traveling in winter would carry fire-starting equipment with them always, because the ability to make fire could literally be the difference between life and death. But even the best boots couldn't keep feet warm indefinitely in sub-zero temperatures, so the Vikings had strategies for that too. If you were going to be outside for an extended period, you periodically had to warm your feet. This could mean ducking into a building if one was nearby, or if you were traveling, it might mean stopping to build a small fire. Vikings traveling in winter would carry fire-starting equipment with them always, because the ability to make fire could literally be the difference between life and death. Now let's talk about diet in more detail, because what the Vikings ate during winter was absolutely crucial to their survival. The human body is a furnace, constantly burning calories to generate heat and power movement. In cold weather, the body has to work harder, burning more calories just to maintain core temperature. A Viking living through an Arctic winter might need 3,000 calories a day or more, significantly more than what we'd consider normal today. The diet was heavy on fats and proteins, with relatively fewer carbohydrates than modern diets. Fats are particularly important in cold weather because they provide concentrated calories and they're metabolized slowly, providing sustained energy. Fish, especially fatty fish like herring and salmon, were staples. The Vikings would catch these fish in huge quantities during the summer runs, then salt them, or smoke them, or dry them for winter storage. Meat was also important, though it was relatively scarce. The Vikings couldn't afford to slaughter their animals willy-nilly, because those animals represented future food in the form of milk and eggs and offspring. So meat was rationed carefully, saved for special occasions or periods when the cold was particularly intense and people needed the extra calories. Dairy products were consumed in large quantities. Milk, cheese, butter, and a form of yogurt called skyr. These products could be preserved through winter, and they provided both calories and valuable nutrients. The cheese, in particular, was made in wheels that could be quite large, and it was aged until it was hard enough to last for months without spoiling. Grains provided the bulk of calories for many people. Porridge, bread, and a kind of flatbread that could be dried and stored almost indefinitely. The grains were often mixed with whatever else was available, dried berries or nuts, to make them more nutritious and palatable. One common dish was a sort of gruel made from grain with bits of dried fish or meat mixed in and flavored with salt and whatever herbs were available. Vegetables in winter were mostly root vegetables that could be stored: turnips, carrots, onions, cabbage. These were eaten cooked, usually boiled or added to stews. The Vikings also preserved some vegetables by pickling them, a technique that not only made them last longer, but also provided valuable vitamins during a time when fresh produce was unavailable. And here's something interesting that archaeological evidence has revealed. The Vikings practiced what we'd now call starvation avoidance, rather than hunger prevention. What this means is that they accepted being hungry for much of the winter. They didn't eat until they were full. Instead, they ate enough to maintain function and avoid actually starving. This might sound miserable, and it probably was, but it meant that food supplies lasted longer. They were constantly calibrating, adjusting portion sizes based on how much food remained and how long until spring. If you're still with me on this journey through Viking winter survival, and you're finding yourself drifting peacefully towards sleep, that's wonderful. That's exactly the purpose of this story. But before you drift away completely, consider hitting that subscribe button and that notification bell. There are so many more historical mysteries to explore together, so many fascinating stories from the past that can help us understand the present. And leave a comment, even if it's just a word or two, because hearing from you helps me understand what you want to learn about next. Let's talk now about the psychological strategies the Vikings used to get through winter. Because as brutal as the physical challenges were, the mental and emotional challenges were just as significant. Humans are not meant to be confined in small spaces for months on end. We're not meant to live in darkness for 20 hours a day. We're social creatures who need variety and stimulation and purpose. The Vikings understood this instinctively, and they developed strategies to cope. Storytelling, which we've mentioned several times, was absolutely central to psychological survival. Stories provided entertainment, obviously, but they also provided mental stimulation. Following a complex narrative, remembering details, anticipating what would happen next, all of this kept minds active and engaged. The stories also provided a sense of connection to something larger than the immediate struggle to survive. They connected the Vikings to their past, to their gods, to a mythological framework that gave meaning to their existence. Music served similar purposes. Viking music, from what we can reconstruct, was relatively simple by modern standards. There were no orchestras or complex harmonies, but there were drums and flutes and lyres, stringed instruments that could produce hauntingly beautiful melodies. There was singing, both solo and communal. The songs were about everything: love and loss, battles and adventures, the changing seasons, the beauty of the natural world. Singing together created a sense of unity and shared experience that helped bind the community together. Games were also important. The Vikings played board games, strategy games that could last for hours. The most famous is Hnefataf, a game somewhat like chess, where one player tries to capture the other's king piece. These games required concentration and strategic thinking, keeping minds sharp during the long idle hours of winter. They also provided healthy competition and social interaction. Physical activity was encouraged even in winter, as much as conditions allowed. On days when the weather wasn't too terrible, people would go outside to work or exercise. Even just walking through snow is a workout, and activities like chopping wood or hauling water required significant physical effort. This activity served multiple purposes. It burned calories, which actually helped keep people warm through increased metabolism. It maintained muscle mass and cardiovascular fitness, and it provided a break from the monotony of being indoors. The Vikings also had practices that we might recognize as mindfulness or meditation, though they wouldn't have called it that. Craftwork, the kind of repetitive, focused work involved in weaving or carving or metalworking, has a meditative quality. It allows the mind to settle into a rhythm, to focus on the task at hand, rather than worrying about the future or dwelling on the past. Many Vikings spent hours each day engaged in such work, and it likely had significant mental health benefits. But despite all these coping strategies, winter stay took its toll. Historians and archaeologists have found evidence that suggests Vikings did suffer from what we'd now recognize as seasonal affective disorder, depression caused by lack of sunlight. Some skeletons show signs of vitamin D deficiency. Written sources from later periods, when Vikings had converted to Christianity and started keeping written records, occasionally mention people struggling with melancholy during the dark months. The Vikings dealt with this, as they dealt with most things, through community support. Someone who was struggling wasn't left to suffer alone. Neighbors would visit, drawing them back into social activities. Family members would assign them tasks, giving them a sense of purpose. The community recognized that psychological well-being was essential to survival, and they worked to maintain it, just as they worked to maintain physical health. Now let's consider the role of children in Viking winter survival, because it's fascinating and often overlooked. Children weren't just passengers being carried through winter by their parents. From a very young age, they were active participants in survival. A 4-year-old might be responsible for keeping the fire supplied with small sticks. A 6-year-old could help with food preparation or textile work. By 8 or 9, children were doing significant work, helping to care for animals or working on craft projects that contributed to the household economy. This wasn't child exploitation, though by modern standards it might seem harsh. It was education and it was necessity. Children needed to learn these skills to survive as adults, and the best way to learn was through doing. Moreover, having responsibilities gave children a sense of purpose and contribution. They weren't just mouths to feed. They were valuable members of the household, and that sense of being needed and useful was psychologically important. The way children were treated also reveals something about Viking values. Children were considered precious, but they weren't coddled. The infant mortality rate was high, probably around 30% or more in the first year of life, and parents couldn't afford to become too attached until a child had proven it would survive. But once a child made it through infancy, they were genuinely valued. Viking parents played with their children, told them stories, taught them skills. There's archaeological evidence of toys, little carved figures, and gaming pieces made specially for children. One particularly touching piece of evidence comes from a Viking grave where a mother and infant were buried together, with the infant placed carefully in the mother's arms. The grave goods included toys for the child and a small wooden ship, perhaps meant to carry them both to the afterlife. This suggests a deep emotional bond and a hope that love would continue beyond death. It's a reminder that despite the harsh conditions and difficult lives, Vikings were humans with the same capacity for love and loss that we have today. Let's shift gears and talk about illness and medicine during winter, because this is an area where the Vikings faced enormous challenges. The close quarters of the longhouse, with multiple families sometimes sharing a space, meant that diseases could spread rapidly. A single person coming down with a contagious illness could quickly infect everyone in the household, and from there, it could spread to the entire settlement. The Vikings had various remedies and treatments, drawn from centuries of accumulated knowledge and experimentation. Willow bark for fever and pain, as we mentioned, honey as an antibiotic for wounds, various herbs for digestive problems or respiratory issues. Some of these remedies were effective, others were probably useless, and some were potentially harmful. The Vikings had no way to scientifically test what worked and what didn't. They relied on observation and tradition, which sometimes led them astray. Serious injuries were particularly problematic. A broken bone could be set, and Vikings were apparently pretty good at this. But infection was always a risk. A deep cut could become infected and turn septic, killing someone who would otherwise have survived. There were no antibiotics, no clean surgical techniques. The best the Vikings could do was keep wounds clean, often by washing them with boiled water or sometimes with alcohol, and then hope for the best. Childbirth, as we mentioned earlier, was dangerous. Women giving birth during winter faced additional risks because if something went wrong, help might not be able to reach them through the snow and cold. Midwives had techniques for dealing with common problems, like a baby in breech position or a mother bleeding too heavily after delivery, but their options were limited. Many women died in childbirth, and many babies were stillborn or died shortly after birth. The Vikings had a fatalistic attitude toward death that helped them cope with these losses. They believed that each person's death was predetermined by the Norns, the three goddesses who wove the threads of fate. When someone died, it was because their thread had been cut and there was nothing anyone could have done to prevent it. This belief helped people accept losses that might otherwise have been unbearable. It wasn't that they didn't grieve, they absolutely did, but they didn't torture themselves with what-ifs and if-onlys. Religious practices played a significant role in winter life. The Vikings, before their conversion to Christianity, were polytheists who worshipped a pantheon of gods. Different gods were associated with different aspects of life, and people would make offerings and prayers to whichever god seemed most relevant to their needs. In winter, offerings might be made to Thor for protection from storms, or to Freyr for the promise of spring and fertility, or to Odin for wisdom to navigate difficult decisions. These religious practices took place both in the home and in communal spaces. Each household had a small shrine or sacred area where offerings could be made. Larger religious ceremonies involving the whole community might take place in a special building or outdoor sacred site, weather permitting. These ceremonies served both religious and social purposes, bringing the community together and reaffirming shared beliefs and values. The winter solstice, the longest night of the year, was particularly significant. It marked the turning point when days would start getting longer again, and it was celebrated with a festival called Yule. This celebration involved feasting, if food could be spared, the burning of a large Yule log, and various rituals meant to ensure the sun's return and the arrival of spring. Many modern Christmas traditions actually have their roots in these ancient Yule celebrations. Adopted and adapted as Christianity spread through Scandinavia. Now let's talk about what happened when things went wrong, when despite all the preparation and precautions, disaster struck. Because it did happen. Fires could break out in a longhouse, and with so much wood and thatch, a fire could spread with terrifying speed. If the fire couldn't be quickly controlled, the entire building could be lost, along with all the supplies stored there. In the middle of winter, losing your longhouse was essentially a death sentence, unless your community could take you in. Storms could be so severe that they caused structural damage, tearing roofs off, or collapsing walls. If this happened in the middle of a blizzard, there might be no way to make repairs, and the family would have to huddle in whatever shelter they could improvise while the storm raged around them. Food stores could be lost to various problems: rot, pests, flooding if a storage pit wasn't properly waterproofed. Each of these disasters was life-threatening, and the Vikings lived with that awareness constantly. But the community safety net was strong. If one family lost their home or supplies, the rest of the community would step in. They'd provide shelter, share food, help rebuild. This wasn't charity in the modern sense. It was survival insurance. Everyone knew that next time it might be their family in need, and they'd want others to help them. This created a powerful incentive for generosity and mutual support. There are accounts from later written sources of particularly harsh winters when entire communities came close to starvation. In these desperate times, people made difficult choices. The very old and the very weak might choose to go out into the snow, sacrificing themselves so that younger, stronger people would have a better chance of surviving. This sounds horrific to modern sensibilities, and it was indeed tragic, but it was also seen as honorable. To die so that others might live was considered a worthy death, and such people were remembered and honored. But let's move away from these dark possibilities and talk about something more uplifting: the creativity and artistry that flourished even during the hardest times. The Vikings were master craftspeople, and winter was when much of this work was done. With limited outdoor work available, people turned to indoor crafts, and the results were often spectacular. Wood carving was particularly important. The Vikings carved everything from practical items like bowls and utensils to decorative pieces like the beautiful dragon head posts that adorned ships and buildings. The carving was incredibly intricate, often featuring intertwined animals and complex geometric patterns. This work required patience and skill and artistic vision, and the Vikings had all three in abundance. Metalworking continued in winter too, though on a smaller scale than in summer, when larger forges could be operated outdoors. Blacksmiths worked on jewelry, weapons, and tools. Viking jewelry is particularly noteworthy, combining functionality with beauty. Brooches and pins weren't just decorative, they were essential for fastening clothing. But they were often elaborately designed, cast in silver or bronze, and sometimes inlaid with gold or precious stones. Textile work, which we've mentioned several times, was a major winter activity. Weaving produced the cloth that everyone depended on for clothing and household items. But it was also an art form. The patterns woven into cloth could be quite complex, and the dyes used to color the threads produced a range of hues from deep blues and reds to subtle greens and yellows. The dyes came from natural sources, plants, minerals, even certain insects and shellfish. Obtaining and preparing these dyes was labor-intensive, but the results were worth it. Before we continue deeper into this story, I want to take a moment to acknowledge you, the listener. You've been with me for hours now, journeying through time to this harsh but fascinating world. If you're finding this relaxing, if it's helping you wind down and prepare for sleep, that's wonderful. That's the goal. But if you're still awake and engaged, maybe take a moment to like this video and leave a comment. Tell me what you think. Are there aspects of Viking life you'd like to know more about? Are there other historical topics that interest you? Your feedback genuinely helps shape future content, and I read every comment. Let's explore the relationship between Vikings and their animals in more detail, because this was absolutely central to winter survival. We've mentioned that animals lived in attached buildings or sometimes shared the longhouse itself with the humans. This close coexistence created a unique relationship. These animals weren't pets in the modern sense, though individual animals might be given names and treated with affection. They were working animals, economic assets, survival tools, but they were also, in a very real sense, partners in the struggle to survive. Cows were particularly valuable. A milk cow could produce milk even through winter, though the quantity would decrease compared to summer. That milk could be consumed fresh, made into butter or cheese, or even used in cooking and baking. The butter and cheese could be stored, providing concentrated nutrition that would last for months. When a cow finally grew too old to produce milk, it would be slaughtered and every part would be used. The meat would be eaten, the hide would be turned into leather, the bones would be made into tools and needles. Even the hooves and horns could be boiled down for glue. Goats were also common, particularly in areas where the terrain was too rough for cattle. Goats are hardy animals that can survive on less food than cows, and they produce both milk and meat. They're also famously able to eat almost anything, which made them useful for consuming food scraps that humans couldn't eat. Sheep were absolutely essential, as we've discussed. The wool was the foundation of Viking textile production, and mutton provided meat. Sheep are also relatively easy to care for, though they're vulnerable to predators and harsh weather. During the worst winter storms, sheep might be brought right into the longhouse itself, crowded into a corner where they could be kept safe and their body heat could benefit the humans. Chickens were kept for eggs primarily, though old chickens would eventually be eaten. Eggs were a valuable source of protein, and chickens would lay sporadically, even through winter if they were kept warm enough and fed adequately. Some families also kept ducks or geese which provided eggs, meat, and feathers that could be used for insulation or fletching arrows. Horses held a special status. They were working animals, used for transportation and pulling plows and carts. But they were also status symbols, expensive to keep and maintain. Only wealthier families could afford horses. In some cases, horses were even given formal burials when they died, sometimes alongside their owners, suggesting they were viewed as more than just livestock. Dogs were common and served multiple purposes. They guarded the settlement, alerting people to approaching strangers or predators. They helped with herding animals. They might assist in hunting. And yes, they provided companionship. Vikings definitely formed emotional bonds with their dogs, as humans have throughout history. There are even runic inscriptions from later periods that mention beloved dogs by name, mourning their deaths. Cats were less common, but present, valued for their ability to control rodents. A good mouser could save significant amounts of stored grain from being eaten by mice and rats. Cats, being somewhat independent creatures, probably weren't as emotionally significant to Vikings as dogs, but they were appreciated for their practical contributions. The care of these animals through winter was a massive undertaking. They needed to be fed, and the feed had to have been grown and harvested and stored during summer. Hay, dried grass that animals could eat through winter, had to be cut and stored in huge quantities. A single cow might need several pounds of hay per day, and a settlement with a dozen cows would need tons of hay to get through winter. Storing this hay, keeping it dry so it wouldn't rot, was a logistical challenge in itself. Animals needed water, which, as we've discussed, had to be created by melting snow. They needed their living spaces cleaned regularly because the accumulation of waste would create unsanitary conditions that could lead to disease. This was unpleasant work, especially in cold weather, but it was absolutely necessary. The waste, animal manure, was valuable though. It would be saved and spread on fields in spring as fertilizer, helping the next year's crops grow. Animals also got sick and injured, and the Vikings had to deal with these problems. They had remedies for some common livestock ailments, herbal treatments, and practical interventions. But veterinary medicine was even more limited than human medicine, and often the only option when an animal got seriously ill was to slaughter it quickly, salvaging whatever meat and other products they could before the animal died and the meat spoiled. The loss of a valuable animal, like a milk cow or a horse, could be economically devastating for a family. It wasn't just the immediate loss of whatever that animal produced. It was the loss of all future production, all the milk or labor or offspring that animal would have provided. Some families never recovered from such losses, sliding into poverty that might take generations to escape. Now let's talk about trade and economy during winter, because even though travel was difficult, it didn't stop entirely. Vikings were traders as much as they were raiders, and trade networks stretched across vast distances. Even in winter, hardy traders might travel between settlements, bringing goods and news. These winter traders were tough individuals, willing to risk the journey for the potential profits. They might travel on skis, which Vikings used extensively in winter. These weren't the sleek modern skis designed for recreation. They were long, sturdy pieces of wood, shaped and polished, that allowed relatively quick travel across snow. Vikings could cover surprising distances on skis, moving much faster than they could by walking through deep snow. The traders brought goods that settlements couldn't produce themselves. Salt was particularly valuable, essential for preserving food. Iron and steel, which not every settlement could smelt. Fine cloth and luxury items for those who could afford them. News and gossip were also commodities. In a world without mass communication, A trader who brought word of events in other places was welcome even if they had nothing physical to sell. Payment for these goods came in various forms. Vikings used a system based on silver by weight. They didn't have coins in the modern sense, at least not universally. Instead, they used hack silver, pieces of silver cut or broken from larger objects and valued by weight. A trader might have a small scale to weigh silver, determining the value of a transaction. A barter was also common. Excess furs or wool might be traded for iron. Preserved fish might be exchanged for grain. The exchange rates for these barter transactions were based on negotiation and tradition, and skilled traders knew how to drive a hard bargain while still maintaining goodwill. Cheating or being unfair in trade could destroy your reputation, and in Viking society, reputation was everything. This brings us to the concept of honor, which was absolutely central to Viking culture. Honor wasn't just about bravery in battle, though that was part of it. Honor was about keeping your word, treating others fairly, fulfilling your obligations to family and community. A man without honor was an outcast, unable to participate fully in society. The same was true for women, though the specific expectations of honor differed somewhat by gender. Insults to honor had to be answered. This could lead to feuds, long-running conflicts between families that might last for generations. The sagas are full of stories about feuds, describing in intricate detail the insults and revenges that perpetuated cycles of violence. These feuds were socially destructive, but they made sense within the Viking honor system. If you didn't respond to an insult, you were admitting weakness, and that could make you a target for further exploitation. But there were mechanisms for resolving disputes without violence. The thing, an assembly where the community gathered to make decisions and adjudicate conflicts, served as a kind of court system. Disputes would be presented, evidence and arguments would be heard, and the assembly would render judgment. These judgments were binding, and someone who refused to accept a thing's decision could be declared an outlaw, literally outside the law's protection. Anyone could kill an outlaw without fear of punishment, and an outlaw's property could be seized. This was effectively a death sentence, a way of enforcing social norms without requiring a central authority. The thing couldn't meet in the dead of winter when travel was impossible, but disputes that arose during winter would be remembered and brought before the thing once conditions allowed. This created an incentive for people to behave themselves during winter, knowing that if they wronged someone, they'd have to answer for it eventually. Let's turn our attention now to the spiritual and supernatural aspects of Viking winter life. The Vikings lived in a world that was, to their understanding, populated by supernatural beings. Gods and goddesses, of course, but also elves and dwarves, giants, and various kinds of spirits. These beings were believed to influence events in the natural world, and people tried to maintain good relationships with them through offerings and proper behavior. Certain places were considered sacred, inhabited by spirits or associated with particular gods. These places had to be treated with respect. Certain actions were forbidden in sacred spaces, and violations could bring bad luck or even divine punishment. Many Viking settlements had sacred groves or springs near them, places where people could go to make offerings or seek guidance. The land spirits, landvetir, were particularly important. These spirits were believed to inhabit the landscape itself, living in mountains and forests and bodies of water. They had to be propitiated, kept happy through proper behavior and occasional offerings. If you moved to a new place, you made offerings to the land spirits to ensure they'd accept your presence. If a settlement suffered a series of misfortunes, people might wonder if they'd somehow offended the land spirits. A concept of fate, which we touched on earlier, permeated Viking thinking. The future was believed to be predetermined, woven by the Norns. and yet people still had to make choices and take actions. This created an interesting philosophical tension. If everything was fated, did your choices really matter? The Viking answer seemed to be that, yes, choices mattered, because how you faced your fate defined who you were. A brave man facing inevitable death with courage was admirable. A coward trying to escape his fate was contemptible, even though both would end up in the same place. This fatalistic worldview helped Vikings cope with the uncertainty and danger of their lives. When you lived in a world where death was always close, where a storm or sickness or accident could kill you at any moment, believing that your death was predetermined could be oddly comforting. It removed the burden of trying to avoid death. Instead, you focused on living with honor and courage so that when your thread was cut, you'd be remembered well. Dreams were taken very seriously. They were believed to be prophetic, offering glimpses of the future or warnings of danger. A person who had a vivid or disturbing dream would discuss it with others, trying to interpret its meaning. Certain people were believed to have more reliable prophetic dreams than others, and their interpretations would carry particular weight. Magic was real to the Vikings, though dangerous. Satyr, a form of Norse magic, was practiced by specialists, usually women, though not exclusively. Satyr practitioners could supposedly see the future, influence events, heal or harm. But practicing satyr was also seen as somewhat unmanly for men, as it involved a kind of passivity and receptivity that violated masculine ideals. Nevertheless, even the god Odin practiced satyr, according to the myths, suggesting that its power outweighed concerns about propriety. Runes, the Norse writing system, were believed to have magical properties beyond their use as letters. Carving certain runic inscriptions could bring good luck, protect against evil, heal injuries. Whether these beliefs had any basis in reality is obviously questionable, but what matters is that Vikings believed them, and these beliefs shaped their behavior and gave them a sense of control in an uncontrollable world. Let's talk about time and how Vikings perceived it, because this is fascinatingly different from our modern understanding. Vikings didn't have clocks or even really a concept of measuring time in hours and minutes. Time was marked by natural events, sunrise and sunset, the positions of stars, the stages of the moon. In winter, when the sun barely rose and set, other markers had to be used. The lighting of lamps, the feeding of animals, the communal meals. These created a rhythm to the day, even when the sky provided little guidance. The year was divided into seasons and marked by important dates, but these weren't arbitrary. They were tied to observable phenomena. The winter solstice, when the sun's path began to lengthen again. The spring equinox, when day and night were of equal length. The summer solstice, the longest day. The autumn equinox, when day and night were again equal. These weren't just dates on a calendar. They were cosmic events that directly affected people's lives and work. Within this framework, there was a cyclical view of time. The year turned like a wheel, winter to spring, to summer to autumn, and back to winter. Life followed similar cycles: birth, growth, maturity, age, death. These cycles repeated endlessly, and there was a certain comfort in that predictability. Winter would always give way to spring. Death would be followed by new life. The world would continue. This cyclical view of time contrasts with the linear view that's dominant in modern Western culture, where we see time as a line extending from past through present into future, with progress and development moving us towards some ultimate goal. Vikings didn't think that way. For them, the goal wasn't to reach some future state. It was to live honorably within the eternal cycle, to play your part well before the cycle moved on without you. Now, as we've been talking for quite a while, let me paint you one more detailed scene from a Viking winter, bringing together all the elements we've discussed. It's late January, deep in the heart of winter. The settlement is locked in by snow and ice. The temperature is well below zero, and the wind makes it feel even colder. Inside a particular longhouse, a family is gathered for the evening. The langold burns steadily, providing warmth and light. The family sits around it, engaged in various activities. The father is sharpening a knife, the rhythmic sound of whetstone on steel creating a meditative background noise. The mother is spinning wool, her hands moving automatically through a task she's done 10,000 times. The oldest daughter is weaving at the loom, creating a cloth that will become a new tunic for her younger brother. The son, a boy of about 11, is carving a small figure from a piece of wood, his tongue sticking out slightly as he concentrates. The youngest child, a girl of maybe 5, is playing with a doll made from scraps of cloth and stuffed with wool. She's singing quietly to herself, a song her mother taught her about the sun and the coming of spring. The grandmother, ancient and wizened but still sharp-minded, is telling a story. She's telling about the time she was a young woman and her village was raided by enemies. She describes hiding in the forest, cold and terrified, watching her home burn, but then she describes how the community came together afterward, how they rebuilt, how they survived. It's not a happy story, exactly, but it's an important one. It teaches resilience. It teaches that disaster can be survived, that communities are stronger than individuals, that life goes on even after terrible events. The children listen with wide eyes, imagining themselves in their grandmother's place, wondering if they'd have the courage she showed. Outside, the wind howls. Snow is falling again, adding to the drifts that already bury much of the settlement. Wolves can be heard in the distance, their howls lonely and haunting. But inside the longhouse, the family is safe and warm. They have food. They have shelter. They have each other. For tonight, that's enough. Tomorrow will bring new challenges. The animals will need tending. The fire will need constant attention. Food will need to be prepared. Water will need to be melted from snow. The endless tasks of winter survival will continue. But right now, in this moment, there's peace. The family is together, the fire is warm, and the stories connect them to their past and future. This is the essence of Viking winter survival, not just the practical techniques and technologies, though those are important. Not just the physical toughness and resilience, though those are essential, but this, the human connections, the stories and songs, the shared work and shared warmth, the way people came together to face challenges that would overwhelm any individual. Modern people, with all our technology and comfort, could learn from this. We've gained so much in terms of physical ease and safety, but we've lost something too. We've lost the tight community bonds that formed when survival depended on cooperation. We've lost the satisfaction of creating things with our own hands. We've lost the deep connection to seasons and nature that comes from depending directly on the land for survival. I'm not suggesting we should go back to Viking times. The infant mortality, the violence, the lack of medical care, these were real problems that made life genuinely harder and shorter. But maybe there's a middle ground. Maybe we can keep our modern comforts while also recreating some of that sense of community and purpose and connection. As you drift towards sleep now, imagine yourself in that longhouse. Feel the warmth of the fire on your face. Hear the wind outside, held at bay by sturdy walls and thick thatch. Smell the smoke and wool and the stew bubbling in a pot. Hear the voices of family members talking quietly, the sound of working hands, the crackle of flames. Feel safe, held by the community around you, part of something larger than yourself. This is what the Vikings had, and in some ways, it's what they can still give us. Not their specific solutions, not their exact techniques, but their understanding that survival is communal, that hardship builds character, that there's meaning and purpose in facing challenges together. Before we continue to explore even more aspects of Viking winter life, I want to remind you about this channel. Dreamless Timelines is dedicated to bringing you these long, detailed, relaxing historical narratives. If you're enjoying this journey, if it's helping you relax or learn or both, please subscribe. Click that bell so you'll be notified when new content is released. And seriously, leave a comment. Tell me what you think. What other historical topics interest you? What questions do you have about Viking life or any other period of history? Your engagement helps this channel grow and helps me create better content for you. Let's dive deeper into some specific survival scenarios that Vikings might have faced. Imagine a situation where a family's food stores run critically low in the dead of winter. This wasn't uncommon. Maybe rats got into the grain, or a barrel of salted fish went bad, or maybe the family just miscalculated how much they'd need. What would they do? The first step would be reducing consumption even further. Everyone would go on stricter rations, eating just enough to maintain function. Children might still get adequate food because they're growing and their survival is crucial for the family's future. But adults would eat less. The elderly might voluntarily reduce their portions even more, ensuring the younger generation's survival. Next, the family would seek help from neighbors. This wasn't begging. It was activating the reciprocal obligations that bound the community together. If this family had shared their bounty in the past or had helped neighbors in other ways, those neighbors would share now. Not out of charity, but out of mutual obligation and the understanding that they might need similar help someday. If the shortage was severe and widespread, affecting multiple families, the community might pool resources. All the remaining food would be inventoried and distributed according to need, with larger families getting more and smaller families getting less. This communal approach ensured that no one starved while others still had food, and it reinforced the bonds that held the community together. In truly desperate situations, people might venture out hunting despite the harsh conditions. Winter hunting was dangerous and often unsuccessful, but if the alternative was starvation, it was worth the risk. Rabbits and other small game could sometimes be trapped or hunted. In coastal areas, seal hunting was possible even in winter, though incredibly dangerous. A seal provided a lot of meat and blubber, enough to keep a family going for weeks. But hunting them involved going out on ice or into freezing water, where one mistake could be fatal. Another extreme option was fishing through the ice, which we've discussed, but doing it more intensively than normal. Instead of just checking nets occasionally, families might camp out by the ice holes, fishing continuously, desperate for any food they could catch. This was miserable work, sitting exposed to the wind and cold for hours, but hunger is a powerful motivator. Let's consider another scenario, a major injury occurring during winter. Imagine one of the men falls while working on a roof and breaks his leg. This is a crisis. A broken leg in winter could easily lead to death, either from complications or from the injured person's inability to contribute to survival work. The break would need to be set immediately, before swelling made it impossible. The Vikings had learned through experience how to manipulate broken bones back into alignment. It was agonizing for the patient, but it had to be done. Once the bone was aligned, splints would be applied, usually wooden slats bound tightly with cloth or leather strips to immobilize the leg. The patient would need to stay off the leg for weeks, allowing it to heal. This created a burden for the rest of the family, who had to take over the injured person's work. But again, the community would step in. Neighbors would help with tasks the family couldn't manage alone. This wasn't just kindness, it was pragmatic. A family whose primary worker was incapacitated could fail to survive, and if they failed, the whole community was weaker. Better to help them through the crisis and keep the community intact. Pain management was limited. Willow bark, as we've mentioned, helped somewhat. Alcohol might be used, not just to numb the pain, but to help the patient sleep, allowing time to pass more quickly. Some herbs had mild sedative properties and might be used, but ultimately, the patient had to endure a lot of pain, and Vikings were expected to do so stoically. Complaining excessively was seen as weak and shameful. The injury would keep the person bedridden for weeks, lying on the sleeping platform near the Langeld. They'd have time to think, to watch the family going about their daily work, to feel simultaneously grateful for their care and guilty about being a burden. This psychological aspect of recovery was significant. A person's sense of self-worth was tied up in their ability to contribute, and being helpless went against everything Vikings valued. But if the bone healed well and the person recovered full mobility, they'd rejoin the working community with stories to tell and perhaps a limp that would mark them for the rest of their life. If the bone healed poorly, if the person ended up permanently disabled, their life would become much harder. They'd have to find new ways to contribute, tasks they could do despite their limitation. The community would support them, but there would also be an expectation that they'd pull their weight in whatever way they could. Let's imagine one more scenario. The arrival of strangers during winter. This would be unusual and potentially dangerous. Travelers in winter were rare, and their presence would raise questions. Who were they? What did they want? Were they peaceful traders? Or were they raiders scouting for a future attack? The strangers would be met with caution, but also with hospitality, because hospitality was a sacred obligation in Norse culture. They'd be invited in, given food and drink, allowed to warm themselves by the fire. But they'd also be watched carefully, and their weapons would be politely but firmly requested. A guest shouldn't need weapons inside a host's home, after all. Once the immediate necessities were taken care of, questions would be asked. Where did you come from? Where are you going? What news do you bring? The stranger's answers would be evaluated for truthfulness. Vikings were good at reading people, at spotting inconsistencies and lies. A stranger who told a convincing story and behaved honorably might be welcomed and allowed to stay for several days, enjoying the settlement's hospitality. But a stranger who seemed suspicious or told an unconvincing story might be asked to leave as soon as conditions permitted. And if the strangers refused to leave or made threatening moves, the men of the settlement would respond. Viking hospitality had limits, and threats to the community's safety couldn't be tolerated. The arrival of strangers also brought opportunity. They might have trade goods or news from distant places. They might be skilled in some craft that the settlement needed. There are stories in the sagas of wandering craftsmen, specialists in metalworking or shipbuilding or other valuable skills, who would travel from settlement to settlement, offering their services in exchange for food and shelter. These traveling specialists were valued, as they brought knowledge and capabilities that local people might lack. Sometimes the strangers were refugees, people whose own settlement had suffered some disaster. A fire that destroyed their homes, a raid that killed many of their people, a sickness that decimated their population. These refugees needed help, and the question of whether to take them in was serious. More mouths to feed through winter was a burden, but turning away people in desperate need was dishonorable. Usually, the community would help, sharing what they could spare and helping the refugees make plans for rebuilding in the spring. Now let's talk about something we haven't touched on much: personal hygiene and grooming during winter. You might imagine that Vikings, living in close quarters with limited water, would have been pretty filthy. But actually, Vikings were quite concerned with cleanliness, more so than many of their medieval European contemporaries. They bathed regularly, at least once a week, and often more frequently. Hot baths were taken in wooden tubs filled with water that had been heated over the fire. This was labor-intensive, requiring a lot of water and a lot of fuel to heat it. But it was considered important. Bathing wasn't just about removing dirt. It was about health, comfort, and social respectability. The Vikings also had saunas, a tradition they may have adopted from contact with Finnish peoples or developed independently. A sauna is basically a small building or room that's heated to very high temperatures. You sit in the heat until you're sweating profusely, then cool off quickly, sometimes by rolling in snow or plunging into cold water. This cycle of hot and cold was believed to be healthy, and it probably did have benefits, improving circulation and helping with muscle tension. Hair and beard care was taken seriously, especially by men. Vikings combed their hair and beards daily, using combs made from bone or antler. They often wore their hair long, sometimes braided or tied back, and many men had elaborate beards. These weren't just left to grow wild. They were trimmed and shaped, sometimes even decorated with beads or rings. A well-groomed appearance signified self-respect and social status. Women also took care with their appearance. Long hair was the norm, often braided in complex patterns. Married women typically covered their hair with a head covering of some kind, while unmarried women might leave theirs uncovered. Women used combs and hairpins, and they might use herbs or other natural products to clean and condition their hair. Dental hygiene was practiced too, though not to modern standards. Vikings used small sticks, frayed at one end, to clean their teeth. They might also use cloth to wipe their teeth and gums. Dental problems were common, as they were throughout the medieval world, but Vikings did what they could to maintain oral health. Clothing was kept clean through regular washing, as we discussed, but also through airing and brushing. Wool garments would be taken outside and shaken vigorously to remove dirt and debris. They'd be brushed with stiff bristles to raise the nap and restore their insulating properties. This maintenance work was constant and necessary because clean, well-maintained clothes worked better at keeping you warm. Personal grooming and cleanliness served multiple purposes. There was the practical aspect, health and hygiene that prevented disease and parasites. There was the social aspect, appearing respectable and well-kept to your community. And there was the psychological aspect, maintaining self-respect and a sense of civilization even in the midst of winter's hardships. This attention to personal care, even when it would have been easier to let things slide, speaks to something fundamental about Viking character. They maintained standards. They didn't give up on being fully human just because conditions were harsh. This resilience, this refusal to be defeated by circumstances, was a defining characteristic of Viking culture. The story continues, much like the winter itself, with days blending into each other in a rhythm of survival and small victories. Each dawn brings the same challenges: tending the fire, caring for animals, preparing food, maintaining equipment, staying warm. But within this repetitive structure, there's life and variation. Some days bring visitors or news. Some days bring mild weather that allows for outdoor work. Some days bring storms that confine everyone indoors. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, but then more obviously, the days lengthen and winter begins its retreat. Let's talk about the dreams that Vikings had during these long winter nights. Sleep, when you're living in close quarters with limited stimulation, takes on a different quality than in our busy modern lives. Vikings often reported vivid, intense dreams, and they believed these dreams carried meaning and significance. In one particular longhouse, a young woman named Helga wakes suddenly in the middle of the night. Her heart is pounding, and she's covered in sweat despite the cold. She's just had a dream so vivid, it felt more real than waking life. In the dream, she was standing on a cliff overlooking the sea. Storm clouds gathered overhead, and the waves below crashed violently against the rocks. Then a ship appeared, sailing directly toward the cliff, as if it couldn't see the danger. She tried to shout a warning, but no sound came from her throat. The ship struck the rocks and shattered, and she woke up. Helga lies there in the darkness, trying to understand what the dream means. Her brother is planning to go raiding next summer. Is this a warning about his voyage, or does it mean something else entirely? She decides to tell her mother about the dream in the morning. Her mother has a reputation for understanding dreams, for seeing the patterns and symbols that others miss. When morning comes and Helga describes her dream, her mother listens carefully. She asks questions about details. What color was the sail? Which direction was the wind blowing? Were there birds in the sky? Each detail might be significant, might provide clues to the dream's meaning. Finally, the mother gives her interpretation. The dream is indeed a warning, but not necessarily about Helga's brother. It's about the family's plans for the coming year. They need to be cautious, to avoid rash decisions, to watch for dangers that might not be immediately obvious. This interpretation satisfies Helga, gives her a sense that the dream has been understood and its warning heeded. Whether the interpretation is correct, or whether it even matters in any objective sense, is beside the point. The important thing is that the dream has been acknowledged and integrated into the family's decision-making process. This is how Vikings dealt with the unconscious messages that bubbled up during sleep, treating them as valuable information rather than dismissing them as meaningless. The interpretation of dreams, the telling of stories, the maintenance of traditions, all of these were ways that Vikings processed their experiences and made sense of their world. They didn't have therapy or counseling or self-help books. They had each other, and they had frameworks for understanding passed down through generations. Let's explore another aspect of Viking winter life that's often overlooked: romance and relationships. You might think that winter, with its hardships and close quarters, would be a terrible time for romance. But actually, winter had its own romantic possibilities. Young people who might be too busy with fieldwork and travel during summer had time during winter to get to know each other, to talk and laugh and discover whether they were compatible. Courtship in Viking society was a complex affair, bound by rules and traditions. A young man interested in a young woman couldn't just approach her directly. He had to go through proper channels, speaking first to his own family, and then, if they approved, to her family. The families would evaluate the match, considering factors like social status, wealth, family reputation, and the personal compatibility of the young people involved. But before any of that formal process began, young people found ways to interact and assess each other. During winter gatherings, when multiple families came together for storytelling or celebrations, young people would sit near each other, exchange glances, find opportunities for brief conversations. These interactions were carefully observed by everyone present. Nothing was private in a Viking settlement, and any romantic interest would be noted and discussed. If a young man was interested in a young woman, he might demonstrate his worthiness through actions. He'd volunteer for difficult tasks, showing his strength and capability. He'd tell clever stories or make witty remarks, demonstrating intelligence. He'd be generous with whatever resources he had access to, sharing food or small gifts. The young woman, meanwhile, would be evaluating him, watching how he treated others, how he responded to challenges, whether he kept his word. Astrid, watching her son Eric navigate these social waters, is reminded of her own youth. She remembers the winter she met Bjorn, how he caught her attention by helping her father repair a broken plow without being asked. She remembers the long conversations they had during winter evenings, sitting near the fire in her father's longhouse, talking about their dreams and plans for the future. She remembers the way her heart would speed up when he entered a room, how she'd find excuses to be near him. The formal betrothal came the following spring, after the families had negotiated the terms. There was a bride price to be paid, gifts exchanged, promises made. The wedding itself happened in summer, a major celebration with feasting and gift-giving and the joining of two families. But the real relationship, the foundation of their marriage, had been built during those winter months of getting to know each other. Now Eric is showing interest in Sigrid, and Astrid watches with a mixture of emotions. Pride that her son is becoming a man, anxiety about whether Sigrid is the right match for him, nostalgia for her own youth, and the excitement of new love. She doesn't interfere, but she observes, ready to offer advice if Eric asks for it. Winter is also a time when existing relationships are tested and strengthened. Living in close quarters for months can strain even the best marriages. Couples who might normally have space and separate activities are constantly together, constantly aware of each other's presence. Small annoyances can build into serious conflicts. A husband's habit of cracking his knuckles becomes unbearably irritating. A wife's way of humming while she works starts to grate on her husband's nerves. But these conflicts also provide opportunities for growth. Couples learn to communicate better, to address problems before they escalate, to find compromises and accommodations. A successful Viking marriage required these skills because life was too hard for partners who couldn't work together effectively. The couples who made it through winter with their relationship intact often found that they were stronger for it, more tightly bonded, more capable of facing whatever challenges came next. The elderly in Viking society held a special place during winter. They were repositories of knowledge and experience, living libraries who remembered things that happened before anyone else was born. During the long winter evenings, the elderly would share their memories, teaching younger generations about the past. Old Thorstein, who's lived through more than 70 winters, sits by the Langold in his daughter's longhouse and tells stories about the old days. He remembers when there was a great famine, when the summer was cold and wet and the crops failed. He describes how the settlement almost didn't survive, how they had to eat things that normally wouldn't be considered food, bark and roots, and even leather that had been boiled soft. He tells how the neighboring settlement actually did fail, how the survivors had to be absorbed into other communities because there weren't enough of them left to rebuild. These stories are sobering, reminders that survival is never guaranteed, that even with all the preparation and skill in the world, sometimes circumstances are just too harsh. But they're also empowering in a way. The settlement did survive that terrible time. People endured and persevered and eventually thrived again. If they could survive that, they could survive anything. Thorstein also tells happier stories. He describes the summer when he was a young man and went Viking for the first time, sailing to lands so far south that it was warm all year round. He tells about the exotic goods he saw, spices and silks and fruits that didn't grow anywhere near Scandinavia. He describes the terrifying excitement of his first battle, the chaos and noise, and the strange clarity that came over him when fighting for his life. The children listen to these stories with fascination, but the adults listen too. Even though they might have heard these stories before, they never get old. They're part of the community's collective memory, part of what binds them together. And each time Thorstein tells a story, he might remember a new detail or put a different emphasis on certain parts, keeping the stories fresh and alive. But Thorstein knows, and everyone else knows, though nobody says it, that this might be his last winter. He's grown noticeably weaker over the past year. He sleeps more, eats less, moves with difficulty. He's ready, or as ready as anyone can be, for death. He's lived a full life, raised children who've raised their own children, earned respect in the community, survived more winters than most people ever see. When his thread is cut, he'll face it with the courage that's expected of a Viking. This acceptance of death, this lack of desperate clinging to life, might seem strange to modern sensibilities. We fight death with every resource we have, see it as an enemy to be defeated. Vikings saw death as inevitable, as part of the natural cycle. Fighting against it was pointless. What mattered was how you lived and how you faced death when it came. Let's shift perspective now and look at the settlement from above, like a bird soaring over the snow-covered landscape. From this vantage point, you can see the longhouses clustered together, smoke rising from each one into the cold air. You can see paths tramped through the snow connecting the buildings, evidence of the constant movement required for survival. You can see the darker shapes of the animal barns attached to the longhouses. You can see the storage buildings and workshops, the docks where ships are pulled up onto shore, the fields buried under snow, waiting for spring. The settlement looks small and fragile from up here, a tiny cluster of human habitation in a vast wilderness. The forest stretches away in every direction, dark pines standing like sentinels. The sea, frozen near the shore but still open further out, moves restlessly under gray skies. Mountains rise in the distance, their peaks lost in clouds. The scale of the landscape dwarfs the human presence, reminding us just how ambitious it was for people to settle here, to claim this harsh land and make it home. But look closer, and you can see the signs of human triumph. Smoke rising from every longhouse means fire is burning, warmth is being maintained, life is continuing. The paths through the snow are evidence of people still moving, still active, still engaged with life despite the cold. The structural integrity of the buildings, standing strong against winter storms, demonstrates the skill and planning that went into their construction. This settlement has been here for generations. The grandparents of the current inhabitants were born here, and so were their grandparents before them. The land has been claimed and tamed, as much as this land can be tamed. The Vikings who live here know every hill and valley, every stand of trees, every stretch of coastline. This is their home, and they've earned it through centuries of survival. Now let's come back down to ground level, back into the warmth of a longhouse, and explore another daily activity that's essential to winter survival: the maintenance and creation of tools and equipment. Vikings were fundamentally practical people. They understood that having the right tools and keeping those tools in good condition could mean the difference between success and failure, even between life and death. A Viking household would have dozens of tools, each designed for specific purposes: axes for chopping wood and clearing land, different sizes and shapes for different tasks, knives for everything from preparing food to crafting leather to close combat, needles and awls for sewing and leatherwork, hammers and chisels for woodworking and metalworking, fishing hooks and nets, farming implements like plows and sickles, shipbuilding tools, weapons. The list goes on. All of these tools required maintenance. Blades needed sharpening. Wooden handles needed checking for cracks and treating with oil to prevent splitting. Metal parts needed cleaning to prevent rust. This maintenance work was ongoing, a constant background task that occupied idle hands during the long winter hours. But winter was also a time for creating new tools. A skilled craftsman might spend weeks creating a single axe head, heating and hammering and folding the metal to create the strongest possible blade. The process required patience and precision, and the result was a tool that would last for generations if properly cared for. Women's tools were no less important than men's. Looms for weaving, drop spindles for spinning thread, needles and scissors and combs. These tools enabled the textile production that was absolutely essential for survival. A broken loom in winter was a serious problem, and women were skilled at maintaining and repairing their equipment. Children learned tool use and maintenance from a young age. A 5-year-old might start with simple tasks like organizing tools or cleaning them. By 8 or 9, they'd be learning to use basic tools under supervision. By their early teens, they'd be proficient with most common tools and starting to learn the more complex skills of toolmaking itself. This practical education was continuous and hands-on. There were no classrooms or textbooks. Instead, children learned by watching adults work, by asking questions, and most importantly, by doing the work themselves, starting with simple tasks and gradually progressing to more complex ones. Mistakes were part of the learning process, though expensive mistakes were obviously discouraged. The accumulation of practical skills was how Vikings measured education. A well-educated person wasn't someone who'd read many books or knew abstract theories. A well-educated person was someone who could do many things competently: build a house, navigate by the stars, smith iron, weave cloth, butcher an animal, sail a ship, fight with weapons, negotiate trade deals, and on and on. Knowledge and skill were the same thing in Viking culture, inseparable and equally valued. Let's talk about conflict resolution within the settlement during winter, because being confined together for months inevitably led to disputes. Two neighbors might disagree about whose animals had damaged whose property the previous summer. A borrowed tool might not be returned or might be returned damaged. Someone might feel they'd been insulted or slighted. These conflicts couldn't simply be ignored because everyone had to interact constantly. The initial approach to conflict was usually direct communication. The aggrieved party would approach the other party and state their complaint clearly. In an ideal situation, the other party would acknowledge the wrong, make amends, and the matter would be settled. But often, things weren't that simple. People had different perspectives on what happened. Pride got in the way of admitting fault. Old resentments surfaced and complicated the current issue. When direct communication failed, mediators would step in. These might be respected elders, family members, trusted by both parties, or just skilled negotiators who had a talent for finding compromises. The mediator would hear both sides, ask questions, and work toward a solution that both parties could accept. The goal wasn't necessarily to determine who was absolutely right and who was absolutely wrong. The goal was to restore peace and allow the community to function. Sometimes this meant compromise, with both parties giving something up. Sometimes it meant one party acknowledging they were wrong and making appropriate amends. Sometimes it meant agreeing to disagree, but promising not to let the disagreement disrupt community harmony. If mediation failed, a matter might be held over until spring, when the thing could meet and render official judgment. But this was a last resort, because it meant months of tension and discord, which could poison community relationships and make everyone's life harder. Physical violence as a way of settling disputes was discouraged within the settlement. A person who responded to every slight with aggression would quickly find themselves isolated, unable to participate fully in community life. Violence was reserved for serious matters, defending against actual threats, responding to grave insults to honor, protecting family members from harm. Even then, violence was supposed to be controlled and proportional, not an uncontrolled rage. This system of conflict resolution worked reasonably well because everyone had a stake in maintaining community harmony. A settlement torn by internal conflict would be weaker, less able to deal with external threats and environmental challenges. So there was social pressure on all parties to resolve disputes in reasonable ways, to compromise when necessary, to put community needs above individual pride. Now, if you're still listening to this long journey through Viking winter, I want to take a moment to acknowledge you again. We're deep into this story now, exploring details and nuances that paint a complete picture of this fascinating culture. If you're finding this helpful for sleep, wonderful. If you're still actively engaged in learning, that's wonderful too. Either way, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Dreamless Timelines for more content like this. Your support really does make a difference, and I'm grateful for every person who takes this historical journey with me. Let's explore now what happened in a Viking settlement when someone died during winter. Death was common, as we've discussed, and the Vikings had well-established practices for dealing with it. But winter complicated things because the ground was frozen solid, making burial difficult or impossible. When someone died, the body would be prepared for burial. It would be washed and dressed in the person's best clothes. Personal items might be placed with the body. Weapons for a warrior, weaving tools for a woman, toys for a child. These items were meant to accompany the deceased into the afterlife, wherever that might be. If the ground was frozen too hard for burial, which it often was in the depths of winter, the body would be placed in a secure structure, protected from animals and weather, to await spring burial. This wasn't ideal, but it was necessary. The cold helped preserve the body, slowing decomposition, so spring burial was practical. A funeral ceremony would be held even if the actual burial had to wait. The community would gather to honor the deceased, sharing memories and stories about the person's life. There might be a funeral feast, with the deceased's family providing food and drink if they could afford it. Poems might be recited, songs sung, all celebrating the person's life and achievements. The Vikings believed in an afterlife, though their concepts of it were complex and sometimes contradictory. Warriors who died bravely in battle might go to Valhalla, Odin's hall, where they'd feast and fight until Ragnarok, the end of the world. Others might go to Hell, a realm that wasn't necessarily terrible, but was certainly less prestigious than Valhalla. Some believed that the dead went to live in their burial mounds, remaining close to the land they'd inhabited in life. These beliefs provided comfort to the living, reassurance that death wasn't a complete end, that the person they'd lost was continuing in some form. Whether these beliefs were literally true was less important than the comfort and meaning they provided. They gave people a framework for understanding death, for processing grief, for moving forward with life. The death of a community member also had practical implications. The deceased's property and responsibilities had to be redistributed. If it was a parent who died, their children needed care. If it was a skilled craftsperson, their knowledge needed to be preserved if possible. The community worked together to ensure that the deceased's death didn't create cascading problems for others. Grief was acknowledged and respected, but it also had limits. excessive mourning that prevented someone from fulfilling their responsibilities was discouraged. Life had to go on, work had to be done, and the dead wouldn't want the living to neglect their duties. This practical approach to grief might seem cold, but it was necessary in a world where everyone's survival depended on everyone else continuing to function. Let's turn now to a particularly harsh February night, when the temperature has dropped to dangerous levels and the wind is howling like tortured spirits. This is the kind of night when just surviving until morning feels like an achievement. Inside the longhouses, families huddle as close to the Langgeld as they can, wrapped in every piece of fabric they own, breathing out clouds of vapor, even inside the shelter of their homes. Bjorn checks the fire constantly this night, adding wood more frequently than usual. The cold is trying to get in through every crack and gap, stealing the hard-won warmth from inside the longhouse. He can hear the wind battering the walls, can feel the structure shaking slightly under the onslaught. This is a testing night, the kind that finds weaknesses in buildings and people alike. Astrid has gathered the children close, creating a nest of bodies and blankets near the fire. She tells them stories to keep their minds off the cold, to pass the time until morning. She tells them about Skadi, the goddess of winter and hunting, who chose her husband by looking only at the feet of the assembled gods. She thought she was choosing the handsome Balder, but the feet belonged to Njord, god of the sea. The marriage didn't work out because Skadi loved the mountains and winter, while Njord loved the sea and summer. But the story has a moral about making choices carefully and living with the consequences. Outside, the cold is so intense that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. The stars are brilliant, painfully bright in the utterly clear air. The northern lights put on a spectacular display, but there's no one outside to watch them. This is a night for survival, not for appreciating beauty. Morning comes slowly, reluctantly, the sun dragging itself above the horizon, as if it too is affected by the cold. When people finally emerge from their longhouses, they find a world transformed. The cold has created ice sculptures everywhere, frozen moisture, forming fantastical shapes. Tree branches are coated in thick ice, sparkling like crystal in the weak sunlight. The snow has a hard crust on it, frozen so solid you can walk on top without breaking through. But everyone has survived. Every longhouse still stands. Every fire still burns. The settlement has endured another trial, and there's a quiet pride in that accomplishment. They faced the worst that winter can throw at them, and they're still here, still functioning, still human. As February turns into March, there's a subtle but definite shift in the quality of the cold. It's still freezing, don't get me wrong, but there's a sense that winter's power is waning. The sun is noticeably higher in the sky, and its light, while not yet warm, has a different quality. The birds that have remained through winter, the ravens and crows and hardy little songbirds, start becoming more active and vocal. The settlement begins preparing for spring in small ways. Tools that will be needed for field work are brought out, inspected, repaired. Seeds, saved from last year's harvest, are checked to make sure they're still viable. Plans are made for which fields will be planted with which crops, taking into account crop rotation and soil fertility. These conversations and preparations are hopeful, looking forward to a time when survival won't require constant vigilance and effort. The children sense the change, too. They have more energy, more restlessness. They've been cooped up for so long that the prospect of being able to run and play outside freely is almost overwhelming. They start asking constantly, "Can we go out? Is it warm enough yet? How many more days until spring?" The adults are patient with these questions, remembering their own childhood impatience with winter's seemingly endless duration. One morning in mid-March, Astrid wakes to a sound she hasn't heard in months: the drip, drip, drip of nighting snow. It's subtle, barely audible, but it's there. The temperature has risen just barely above freezing, and the snow on the south-facing roof is melting, water running off the edge and dripping to the ground. It's one of the most beautiful sounds she's ever heard because it means winter is truly ending. Over the next few weeks, the transformation accelerates. Days get longer and noticeably warmer. The snow begins to melt in earnest, revealing the brown earth beneath. Streams and rivers, frozen solid for months, begin to flow again, the sound of running water everywhere. The ice on the lake starts breaking up, huge sheets, cracking and shifting with sounds like thunder. The animals sense spring too. The cows become restless, eager to get outside after months in the barn. The chickens start laying more eggs. The sheep are shedding their thick winter coats, and the women eagerly collect the wool for spinning. Life is returning, fertility and growth, and the promise of abundance. The first flowers appear, tiny, hardy plants that push up through the still cold soil. They're not much to look at, small and often white or pale yellow, but they're miracles nonetheless. The children bring handfuls of these flowers to their mothers, precious gifts that signify hope and renewal. The adults smile and praise the children, placing the flowers in small containers of water where they can be admired. By early April, the transformation is complete. Winter is over, spring has arrived. The fields are no longer buried under snow. The trees are budding, tiny green leaves beginning to unfurl. The air is filled with the sounds of returning birds, migrants who've spent the winter in warmer lands and are now coming back to breed. The settlement is alive with activity, everyone working frantically to take advantage of the good weather and long days. Bjorn and the other men take the ships off their winter storage, inspecting them carefully for any damage. They repair what needs repairing, caulk seams, raise masts. The ships represent freedom and opportunity, the ability to travel and trade and explore. Some of the younger men will go Vikings soon, sailing off to seek their fortunes. Others will use the ships for fishing and coastal trading. The ships are essential to Viking life, and after months of being landlocked, seeing them ready for the water again is exciting. Eric is preparing for another voyage, his second summer of going Viking. He's more confident now, having proven himself the previous year. He's also showing off more for Sigrid, wanting to impress her with his plans and ambitions. Astrid watches this courtship dance with a knowing smile. She's already discussing with Bjorn the possibility of Eric and Sigrid marrying next year, though nothing official has been said yet. It's too early for formal negotiations, but it's not too early to think about the future. The fields need to be prepared for planting. The men plow the earth, turning over the soil that's been resting all winter. This is back-breaking work, walking behind a plow pulled by oxen, guiding it through the heavy soil. But it's satisfying work too, because it's productive, creating the conditions for the crops that will feed the settlement through the next winter. The women plant vegetable gardens near the longhouses, putting in seeds for the plants that will provide fresh vegetables through summer and early fall. They plant herbs too, both for cooking and for medicine. Every available space is used efficiently because food security depends on maximizing production from the limited growing season. As the community works together on these spring tasks, there's a sense of celebration mixed with the labor. They've survived another winter. Everyone who was alive in October is still alive now, except for old Thorstein, who passed peacefully in his sleep in February. His death was expected and accepted, a natural end to a long life. The settlement mourned him, but also celebrated his life. And his burial in the spring was a dignified affair with the whole community participating. The survival of everyone else, especially the children, is cause for real joy. Every child who makes it through winter to see another spring is a victory. The settlement is healthy and strong, ready to face the challenges of the coming year. The food stores that seemed so desperately low in March are supplemented now with fresh fish and early greens. The worst is over. One evening in late April, when the sun is setting late and the sky is painted in shades of orange and pink, the community gathers for a celebration. It's not tied to any particular religious observance or formal occasion. It's just a gathering to mark the end of winter and the beginning of summer, to enjoy each other's company, to eat and drink and tell stories. There's music and dancing, the first real celebration in months. The food is simple but plentiful, and people eat with genuine pleasure, savoring the variety that winter couldn't provide. There's fresh bread made from the last of the stored grain, knowing that in a few months, there will be new grain to replenish the stores. There's fish, freshly caught and grilled over open fires. There are early vegetables, spring greens that taste impossibly good after a winter of preserved foods. The stories told tonight are different from winter stories. These are stories of adventure and exploration, of the voyages that will soon begin. Young men talk about their plans, where they'll go, and what they hope to accomplish. Older men tell stories of their own adventures, offering advice and warning of dangers. The women talk about the work of summer, the endless tasks of growing and preserving food, making clothes, raising children. But there's excitement in these discussions, anticipation of the busy, productive months ahead. As the evening wears on and the light fades, someone starts singing. It's a song about the eternal cycle of seasons, about how winter always gives way to spring, about how life always returns. Others join in, their voices blending in harmony. The song is old, passed down through generations, and everyone knows the words. Singing together like this, the community is united, celebrating not just survival but life itself. Astrid, sitting with Bjorn and watching their children participate in the celebration, feels a profound sense of contentment. This is what all the struggle was for. Not just to survive, but to live, to experience moments like this, to be part of something larger than herself. The winter tested them, pushed them to their limits, demanded everything they had. And they responded with courage and ingenuity and mutual support. They survived together, and now they'll thrive together through the summer months. But even as she celebrates, Astrid knows that this moment is temporary. Summer will bring its own challenges, its own hard work. And then fall will come again, and winter will return, and the whole cycle will repeat. This is the reality of Viking life, this endless turning of the wheel of seasons. You can't stop it, can't opt out of it. You can only accept it and do your best to thrive within it. But that's okay. The cycle is what gives life meaning. If every day was easy, if survival was guaranteed, if nothing ever challenged you, what would be the point? The struggle is what makes the victory sweet. The darkness of winter is what makes the light of summer precious. The constant risk of death is what makes life valuable. As the celebration winds down and people begin drifting back to their longhouses, Bjorn and Astrid walk slowly through the settlement. They don't need to hurry. The night is warm enough, the stars are beautiful, and they have this moment together. They've been married for 20 years, survived 20 winters together, raised 3 children to adulthood with 2 more lost in infancy. They've built a life together, created something meaningful and lasting. They don't talk much as they walk. They don't need to. After 20 years, they understand each other without words. But the silence is comfortable, companionable, the silence of 2 people who are completely at ease with each other. They're partners in the truest sense, bound together by shared experiences and mutual respect. And yes, love. Though Vikings don't talk about love the way modern people do. When they reach their longhouse, they pause for a moment outside, looking up at the stars. The northern lights are dancing tonight, a spectacular display of green and blue and red ribbons shimmering across the sky. It's a sight they've seen 1,000 times, but it never gets old. The aurora is beautiful and mysterious, a reminder that the world is full of wonders, full of things that can't be fully explained or controlled. Inside the longhouse, the Langeld is burning low, but steady. The sleeping platforms are ready, piled with furs and blankets. But it's warm enough now that they don't need quite as many layers. The terrible cold of deep winter is past. The family settles in for the night, but sleep comes more easily now, without the constant worry about freezing, without the gnawing hunger that characterized the worst of winter. And so another Viking winter comes to an end. The settlement has survived. The families are intact. Life continues. It wasn't easy. It was never easy. Vikings didn't have the luxury of easy, but they had something else: resilience, community, a deep understanding of how to work with their environment rather than against it. They had practical skills passed down through generations, accumulated wisdom about how to survive in one of Earth's harshest climates. But more than that, they had purpose and meaning. They weren't just surviving for survival's sake. They were maintaining a way of life, preserving a culture, raising children who would carry on the traditions. They were part of an unbroken chain, stretching back into the distant past and forward into an unknown future. Every winter survived was a link in that chain, a contribution to something larger than any individual life. As you lie there, listening to this story, perhaps drifting in and out of sleep, I hope you've gained some appreciation for what these people accomplished. They didn't have central heating, or grocery stores, or modern medicine. They had wood and wool and iron, their own hands and minds, and each other. And with these simple resources, they not only survived, but created a rich, complex civilization that would leave its mark on history. The Viking Age is long past. The longhouses are gone, collapsed into the earth centuries ago. The people who lived in them are dust, their names mostly forgotten, except for a few who made it into the sagas. But their legacy remains. Their descendants live throughout Northern Europe and beyond, carrying Viking DNA and perhaps something of that Viking spirit. The languages they spoke evolved into modern Scandinavian languages. From Scandinavia to England to Iceland to even parts of North America still carry traces of their presence. And the techniques they developed for surviving Arctic winters while superseded by modern technology represent a kind of wisdom that we've largely lost. They knew how to live lightly on the land, taking only what they needed, using everything completely, wasting nothing. They knew how to build community bonds strong enough to sustain people through the hardest times. They knew how to find meaning and purpose in struggle, how to maintain their humanity even when circumstances were brutally harsh. In our modern world, we've solved the practical problems that Vikings faced. We can survive winter easily, without constant effort or danger. But we've created new problems in the process: isolation, disconnection from nature, loss of community, lives that can feel empty despite material abundance. Maybe there's something we can learn from the Vikings, not about surviving cold necessarily, but about building lives that are rich and meaningful, about creating communities that genuinely support their members, about facing challenges with courage and practical wisdom. As this story draws to a close, I want to thank you one more time for listening. Whether you're falling asleep to these words or still actively engaged, you've been a companion on this journey through time. If you found value in this exploration, please subscribe to Dreamless Timelines and share this video with others who might enjoy it. Leave a comment telling me what you learned or what surprised you about Viking winter survival. Your engagement helps this channel grow and allows me to continue creating content like this. The story of how Vikings survived Arctic winters without fireplaces is ultimately a story about human ingenuity and resilience. It's about people who refused to be defeated by their environment, who looked at a landscape that should have been uninhabitable and said, "We're going to make this work." And they did. For centuries, they not only survived, but thrived, building a civilization that would influence the entire medieval world. They did it without any single miracle technology. The Langold wasn't a particularly advanced invention. The insulated walls weren't revolutionary. The layered clothing was simple. But put all these elements together, combined with practical knowledge and community cooperation, and you have a system that worked. That's the real genius of Viking winter survival. Not any one brilliant innovation, but a comprehensive approach that addressed every aspect of the challenge. Modern survival experts who study historical techniques often express amazement at how well Viking methods worked. Archaeologists who've reconstructed Viking longhouses and spent time in them report that they're surprisingly comfortable even in harsh winter conditions. The techniques weren't just adequate, they were actually quite effective, providing a quality of life that was probably better than many medieval Europeans enjoyed in milder climates. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, warm and comfortable in your modern bed with your central heating and your insulated walls and all the conveniences of modern life, take a moment to appreciate both how far we've come and what we've learned from our ancestors. The Vikings didn't survive Arctic winters through luck or magic. They survived through knowledge, preparation, cooperation, and sheer determination. These are timeless human qualities, just as valuable now as they were 1,000 years ago. The winter darkness that the Vikings faced each year wasn't just a physical challenge. It was a test of spirit, a trial that demanded everything they had. And year after year, generation after generation, they rose to meet that challenge. They kept their fires burning, their families fed, their communities intact. They told their stories and sang their songs and maintained their humanity, even when the world outside was frozen and hostile. And when spring finally came, as it always did, they didn't just feel relieved, they felt victorious. They'd faced the worst that nature could throw at them, and they'd won. Not because they conquered winter, you can't conquer winter, but because they endured it, adapted to it, found ways to live within it. That's the real triumph. Not domination, but coexistence. Not fighting against nature, but learning to work with it. So let that be the final thought as you drift into sleep. The Vikings showed us that humans are capable of adapting to almost any environment, of surviving almost any hardship, of maintaining culture and community even in the harshest circumstances. We carry that same capability within us. We are the descendants, literal or spiritual, of people who survived ice ages and droughts, who crossed oceans and climbed mountains, who refused to give up even when the odds were overwhelmingly against them. That resilience, that ingenuity, that refusal to be defeated, it's part of our heritage as humans. The Vikings were extraordinary, yes, but they were also ordinary people doing what humans do, surviving, adapting, creating meaning, supporting each other, loving their families, telling stories, dreaming of better times. They were us, just facing different challenges in a different time. And so our journey through a Viking winter comes to an end. We've lived through the darkness and cold, felt the warmth of the Langold, tasted the food they ate, worn the clothes they wore, heard the stories they told, we've experienced, in some small way, what it was like to survive winter without the conveniences we take for granted. We've seen how much harder life was, but also how much richer in some ways, how much more connected to the fundamental realities of existence. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you for listening to this long, detailed exploration of a fascinating topic. If you enjoyed it, remember to like, comment, and subscribe to Dreamless Timelines. There are so many more historical stories to tell, so many more journeys to take together. Until next time, sleep well, dream peacefully, and carry with you the knowledge that you're descended from survivors, from people who faced impossible challenges and overcame them. That strength lives in you, too. Good night, and may your dreams be as vivid as a Viking saga, as peaceful as a spring evening after a long winter, as meaningful as the stories told around the Langold. Rest well, knowing that whatever challenges you face, you carry within you the same resilience that allowed the Vikings to survive and thrive in one of Earth's harshest environments. The story ends, but the lessons continue. Sleep now and wake refreshed, ready to face your own challenges with Viking courage and wisdom. This has been a Dreamless Timelines production. For more relaxing historical journeys, subscribe and turn on notifications. Leave a comment telling us what historical mystery you'd like us to explore next. Sweet dreams, and thank you for listening.